Want to make sure I'm punctual. Welcome to the agenda, the City Council and the Planning Commission, a special meeting with our telecommunication facility ordinance. And I just want to reiterate that this is a workshop. Members of the public wishing to address the City Council Planning Commission on items appearing on the agenda are requested to complete a speaker's card and file it with the city clerk prior to the start of the meeting. Cards are available in the council, I'm guessing in the front. All comments should be limited to 3 minutes unless additional time. Again, I'm very flexible, especially with this workshop. We're not going to be timing. Speakers should state their name and address for the record and must direct their comments to the Council Planning Commission, not the audience or press. While the meeting is in sessions, members of the Council Planning Commission, city staff, and members of the audience are expected to maintain order and decorum and to obey the orders of the mayor/chair. Any meeting participants or members of the audience who engages in disorderly conduct such as hand clapping, stomping of feet, whistling, using profane language, and so on, which disturbs the peace and good order of the meeting or refuses the compliance of unlawful order of the mayor may be ordered removed from the meeting and may be guilty of a misdemeanor. Rhonda, could I have roll call for the council members?
Councilmember Haney.
Here.
Councilmember Clapp. Present. Councilmember Wyrick.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Blatz.
Here.
Mayor Laura.
Here. And could I have roll call for the Planning Commission?
Commissioners Merck, Commissioner Nolan, Commissioner Nicklin,
Yes.
Commissioner Lojowski,
Here.
Commissioner Zabilla. Here. Commissioner Foster,
Here.
and Commissioner Jelligo.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Here. That was good. Yeah.
Well, welcome. And may Chair Foster lead us on the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I just want to reiterate that this is a workshop for our wireless communication facility ordinance. We will be conducting a workshop on the proposed telecommunication facility ordinance. And we do have a presentation to begin with. And I believe, Mr. Clark.
Thank you. Mayor, council members, and members of the commission. I did just want to start out by going over some of the relevant dates that we're going to be dealing with as this ordinance process goes forward. As you'll recall, we adopted a moratorium in April of last year, a moratorium that lasts for a year. And the purpose of that was to give us time, first of all, to wait for the federal government to issue new regulations regarding telecommunications facilities, and then secondly, to put a local ordinance in place that does as much as can be done to give us control over how these are installed. So the regulations came out in October, and since that time we have developed the presentation that's going to be given to you tonight, as well as a proposed ordinance, which is really a starting point for talking. But the adoption process for that ordinance needs to go fairly quickly in order for it to be in place by the time the moratorium goes out of effect. So we will have a planning commission hearing at the commission's February 3rd meeting, regular February 3rd meeting. And at that time, the consulting team will be available, but the commission will be asked to make advisory recommendations to the city council on the ordinance because it's an amendment to the zoning code. Then at the February 27th city council meeting, we'll have a public hearing and the proposed introduction of the ordinance. And assuming that that happens, it would then be adopted on March 10th and take effect on April 10th, which is right at the end of the moratorium period. So today we do have Jonathan Kramer and Tripp May from Telecom Law Firm They're both our technical consultant and our legal consultant on this matter, and they'll be taking us through a workshop which introduces us to the regulatory framework and also takes us through the draft proposed ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we are ready for the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Trip May, and I'll be walking you through both Telecom 101 in terms of how it affects local zoning authority over wireless sites, and then also doing an overview of the proposed draft ordinance. And then we'll talk a little bit about how the federal regulations interplay with the way that the draft ordinance is being proposed. So to begin with, I want to give you an idea of where we're going. Where do I point this to?
You don't have to point, just the arrows on the left and right.
Well,
Our first wireless experiment.
I know. Do we have? It's got batteries.
Sorry about that, if you could bear with us. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you. We had interference. All right, so just to give you a little background, this is where we're headed. We'll talk about the law and the three main bodies of law that we need to digest in order to understand where the ordinance comes from are the Telecom Act of 1996, which lays the bedrock foundation of federal regulations for this area. The shot clock, which is a declaratory ruling by the FCC that interprets some of the provisions in the Telecom Act. And then Section 6409A of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012, which is the most recent change and also the impetus for a lot of ordinance revisions all over the country. And then once we have that under our belt, we'll talk a little bit about the proposed ordinance. So begin with the Telecom Act of 1996. This was a time when wireless was very new and it was very exciting and it had a lot of potential for economic growth. And so Congress decided that it wanted to do something to encourage it, but there was a lot of conflicted purposes within Congress at the time. They wanted to adopt an act that promoted the rapid deployment of these facilities, but at the same time preserved local zoning authority over what is traditionally a local issue. So when you have conflicted purposes, you end up with a very conflicted law. And so the Telecom Act generally preserves all local authority except when it doesn't. And so those are areas of preemption, meaning the federal law controls and local governments don't have room to regulate in there, or their room to regulate is circumscribed by different areas of the law. So jumping into those, the Telecom Act generally imposes 3 substantive limits and 2 procedural ones. The substantive ones are there's no prohibition of wireless services, whether explicit or effective, meaning you can't just say no. There's no unreasonable discrimination between functionally equivalent services or providers, so no favorites. And there's also no regulation of radio frequency exposure to the extent that those emissions or exposures comply with the rules established by the FCC. Procedurally, local governments have to issue written decisions based on substantial evidence in a written record for each permit application that comes in, and those have to be done within a reasonable time. That was the basic law. So I'll give you some of the statute here. The first thing we're going to talk about is the explicit or effective prohibitions. You can see that it just says no. You can't explicitly or effectively prohibit personal wireless services. So when does that happen? Well, explicit ones are easy to find. If it just says no wireless services, that's prohibited. Effective ones are more difficult. The ordinance could put on so many restrictions that effectively you couldn't site a wireless tower anywhere in town. That would be an effective prohibition. Those ones are a little easier to spot too. But could a single permit denial ever effectively prohibit wireless services? And the answer is yes. Here in the Ninth Circuit, the rule is that a single permit denial effectively prohibits wireless services when the applicant demonstrates that a significant gap in its own service coverage exists, and the denied site represents the least intrusive means to mitigate that gap. So what is a significant gap? Nobody knows, frankly. The Ninth Circuit said to themselves that no bright line rule exists to say when a significant gap exists. Each case depends on its own facts and circumstances. We know that it was not intended to cover small dead spots, but it's not exactly clear whether a small area in a densely populated city could rise to a level of significant gap, even though it might not be if it was out in the middle of the countryside. The Ninth Circuit has never been very clear about how you determine one, but they've given us some factors. And these factors are whether there's affecting a big commuter area, a lot of people are involved, whether it's going to improve existing coverage versus add completely new coverage, whether it affects commercial areas, and whether there's a public safety aspect in play. The other side of this is the least intrusive means. So even if the applicant demonstrates that there's a significant gap in its coverage that it needs to mitigate, it must do so with the least intrusive means. So if the site that's being proposed isn't the least intrusive means, the local government doesn't have to approve it if even if there's a significant gap. The least intrusive means has a complicated definition that you need to read twice to understand, but it's essentially the location and design that intrudes the least upon the local values that a denial would serve. So, for example, if the local value is uniformity of height and the site itself is twice the height of the nearest structure, then a denial would serve the local value of uniformity. And so the least intrusive means is the site or sites, multiple sites, that would intrude the least upon the value of a uniform height. Some other important aspects of this are that it's the localities, not the applicants, who decide what the least intrusive means is, and but they must do so through a burden shifting framework. So the way that works is an applicant comes in, they give you a permit application, and it has an alternative sites analysis that shows that they've looked at other sites and they've decided that this is the one that meets their technical needs and is less intrusive than the other ones that they looked at. The local government can rebut that with evidence that technically feasible and potentially available alternatives exist. Technically feasible means that it's not so far away that it wouldn't serve the purposes of the proposed site, and potentially available means that there's a willing landlord somewhere that they can get onto that site. It's a complex analysis. It takes a lot of back and forth and a lot of negotiation between the carriers. But the most important thing, negotiation between the carriers and the local government. But the most important thing is the idea of local values. So if there are local values articulated in an ordinance, the local government can always point back to those and say, we don't think that this is the least intrusive means, because we have a value on the uniformity of height in our own example. It's also good for the applicants because they can look at what those values are and propose sites that are going to meet those in order to conform to what this particular community thinks is important. So they get the service and it intrudes the least upon your local values. The second substantive restriction is an unreasonable discrimination. I think this one is relatively self-explanatory. It means that the same rules have to apply to the same types of people. So if one entity is using wireless technology, to say provide cell phone service, the same rules need to apply to other entities that are using wireless technology to provide any other type of service. It's so long as what you're using is antennas to communicate from point to point, the same rules need to apply. Radio frequency emissions. We discussed this a little bit before, but the idea here is that the local government cannot set its own standards, not higher, not lower, not even the same as what the FCC has set, but they can check for compliance. So you'll notice that in a lot of local ordinances, there's a requirement that the carriers submit an RF emissions compliance report from an independent expert in the field. And when there's a demonstration of compliance, that's where the local involvement in this issue ends. So this is a very restricted area of the Telecom Act. Moving to the substantive restrictions on local authority, all the decisions on a permit have to be in writing, and they have to be based on substantial evidence. Substantial evidence is a relatively low evidentiary standard. It essentially means that amount of evidence that a reasonable person would find sufficient to support the conclusion. So if, for example, the reason for denial is height in our original example, the substantial evidence would be that it's 30 feet above the zoning height limit. It's just that kind of discussion. But it has to be in writing, and it has to be on the record. Recently, the Supreme Court weighed in on this one, and they said that those types of decisions can be separate from the actual reasons. So when you send them a notice saying it's denied or it's approved, you don't have to give the reasons in that particular notice. But when you do that, those have to be in a written record that is available essentially at the same time, and that written record has to have the reasons in a sufficiently clear format. So they can go to the record and see why it was denied at around the same time that they got the denial. And you'll understand why that is important when we talk about a reasonable time. Substantial evidence. Oh, I'm going backwards. So in a reasonable time, as we said, the local government needs to act within a reasonable time, and the FCC decided that they would interpret what that means back in 2009. They said that a reasonable time means 90 days for co-locations. So when you take one site that's already existing and add another site to it, they said that local governments should be able to get through that process in about 90 days. It's 150 days for all other applications. So that includes like new sites or big modifications. It also created procedures for tolling the shot clock, which involves incomplete notices. So if the applicant turns in an application that doesn't have all the information needed for a decision, it's not reasonable to think that the local government could act upon it if it doesn't have all the facts. So the local government can send them an incomplete notice and then stop the clock. Also, both parties can agree to stop the clock by a tolling agreement, which is essentially one signed piece of paper that says we're going to extend the time for review. Now, the written decision is important because after that presumptively reasonable 90 or 150 days runs out, the applicant has 30 days to decide whether they want to sue for an injunction to force the local governments to come to a decision. And so that's why you want to make sure that the reasons are available at essentially the same time as the decision itself, so they can evaluate whether to make that decision. Here's how the shot clock works in graphic form, because it's a lot of words, and essentially, there is 2 clocks, 150 days, 90 days. There's a 30-day cutoff point to deem the application incomplete. After that 30 days, it's presumed incomplete. Local governments can still ask for more information, but they can't stop the clock for anything other than a tolling agreement. Once the presumptively reasonable time runs out, the 30-day clock starts running for whether they can file for a lawsuit. And if they don't file within 30 days, then that issue is closed. In 2015, just about, what was that? January 8th. The 2 weeks ago, the FCC issued clarifications to the shot clock. Essentially, they wanted to make clear that the shot clock always begins to run when the application is submitted, but not when the application is deemed complete. There had been some confusion about that. And then it made the incomplete notices more difficult, where they tightened the rules up on incomplete notices. Essentially, local governments cannot deem an application incomplete twice for 2 different reasons. So when it gets an application in, it has to look through everything that's in there, find all the incomplete items, and then send that notice. Because if they miss one and then they find it later, even within the 30-day period, they cannot deem it incomplete and stop the clock for that reason. They can still request the information. There's no rule against requesting it, but they must find all that information the first time. They also need to cite to the publicly stated source that requires it. So this means that technically, if it's not written down somewhere that you need to turn in a certain piece of information in order for the application to be processed, you can't deem that application incomplete because it's missing it. And so it makes sense on one level. On the other hand, it's going to make the application instructions get really long, because as planners have experience with this, they realize that they were missing something, they'll just add it to the list. And so the list will just get longer and longer. And then lastly, all the shot clocks run during a moratorium. So as Mr. Clark indicated, there's a moratorium in place right now. And so applications that are submitted cannot be acted upon. Under the new federal rules, moratoria are preempted, so that when an application is submitted, the local government must act on it, whether there's a moratorium or not. These rules are not effective right now, but they will be very soon. This moratoria rule for shot clocks for new sites, not for Section 6409 modifications, but for new sites, is going to be effective on February 8th of this year. And for the Section 6409 rules, they're going to be effective on April 9th of this year. So these are coming to a rapid close. So this brings me to Section 6409. And here is the statute in its entirety. It's 147 words. It includes phrases like notwithstanding, and so it's really hard to read, but we can make it easier to read by just paring it down to its essential elements and leaving in the really important phrases. At bottom, Section 6409 states that state and local governments may not deny and shall approve any eligible facilities request so long as it does not substantially change the physical dimensions of an existing wireless tower or base station. In order to understand what this means, we need to define some terms. The first one is eligible facilities request. It's the benchmark for knowing whether we're going to be dealing with Section 6409 or not. An eligible facilities request means co-locations and modifications, which is essentially removals or replacements, of wireless transmission equipment at an existing wireless tower or base station. It's adding something or changing something at an existing wireless tower or base station. But co-locations and modifications have their own definitions too. So co-location means that it's just the mounting or installation of transmission equipment on an eligible support structure. So it's important to note here that when we were talking about co-location before, we had said one site and then adding another site to it. Now it's a little broader. It means basically something and then wireless site on it. That's the technical definition of co-location for the purposes of these rules. But for our purposes, we can think about it as just adding. It's adding transmission equipment. Modification didn't have a great definition inside of the FCC's rules, but it at least includes basically everything else that you could do to an existing wireless site, including removal or replacement of the transmission equipment and any of the supporting structure. It does not include replacement of the entire tower, however. And so all of these are dealing with wireless transmission equipment, which has its own definition, and it's everything. It's literally anything that is reasonably necessary to or normally associated with a wireless site, including the antennas, the radios, the batteries, the backup generators, the cables, the connections, the supports, the mounting brackets, everything. So far our definition is adding essentially anything associated with a wireless site to an existing site. Now we're going to talk about these two phrases, which used to mean essentially what they sounded like. It was either a tower, basically a long, tall pole that had antennas on it, and then a base station normally next to the tower had all the radios in it. The new rules have changed this to have something to a little bit different definitions. An existing wireless tower is based on the purpose for which it was built. So the FCC says it means any structure that was built for the sole or primary purpose of supporting commission licensed or authorized antennas and their associated facilities. So if it was built to support or house wireless transmission equipment for that sole or primary purpose, then it's considered a wireless tower. And here's some examples of traditional, what you might think of as wireless towers. Base station, it means something a little different. It doesn't necessarily have to be built for the purpose of supporting wireless transmission equipment, but it must have wireless transmission equipment on it. So the two conditions that you need to check for whether it's a base station are, is there wireless transmission equipment on it? So does it have a wireless site now? And does that wireless site have a valid permit? If the answers to those two questions are yes, no matter what it is, it's considered a base station. So I've quoted the FCC's definition here and then translated it a little bit to just mean anything with wireless equipment on it that isn't a wireless tower. And so here are some examples that I think are particularly useful. This building here on the left-hand side has antennas in this. This tower was constructed solely for the purpose of housing these antennas, but it was added to this existing structure. So the moment that those antennas were placed upon this building under a valid permit, this whole building became a base station. And so the whole building is open for modification under Section 6409 within the limits of a substantial change. Over here on the right-hand side is a streetlight pole that's had antennas and a radio strapped to the side of it. That looks like it might be a tower, but it's technically a base station because it was built for the purpose of it was built for being a light pole, but they just added wireless equipment to it. So some of these definitions don't always make intuitive sense. Some things that look like wireless towers might be base stations, and some things that look like, just a normal building might in fact be a base station. But it's important to realize just how broad these definitions are. So altogether, an eligible facilities request means adding or altering essentially anything associated with a wireless tower to anything that was built for the sole purpose of supporting that equipment or already has equipment on it under a valid permit. So you can see that an eligible facilities request is pretty easy to satisfy. Almost everything is going to be an eligible facilities request when it's a permit application to add to or modify a wireless site, but that's not the whole test. It not only has to be an eligible facilities request, it has to be one that doesn't substantially change the physical dimensions of the existing wireless tower or base station. And so substantial change doesn't have a definition that existed before the FCC's new order. It just meant something that was in the eye of the beholder. Under its dictionary definition, it could have meant anything that was large or important or fundamental to the site itself. But the FCC decided to go with a more objective definition of a substantial change. And we can run through it in checklist form, but I wanted to give you kind of an overview of what we're going to be looking at. It's based on factors that are more or less empirical. Changes to height, width, the number of equipment cabinets, excavation at the site, effect on the concealment elements, and permit compliance. It's a disjunctive test, which means that it must be within the thresholds for each one of those factors in order to qualify, and if it violates the condition for a substantial change on any of them, it's not, and Section 6409 doesn't apply. So there are a lot of rules to keep in mind, and that it's cumulative, meaning the thresholds that I'm about to explain to you for each one of these factors is a maximum limit. And the way I like to explain this is that it creates sort of an invisible envelope around each base station and wireless tower within which carriers can freely modify and co-locate equipment, whether it complies with the zoning code or not. So we'll run through these factors. The first one is height. And right away you'll notice that a lot of these have to depend on where the tower or where the base station is and whether it is a wireless tower or a base station. So understanding the definitions is going to be critical to understanding whether it causes a substantial change or not. For towers, it's 10% or 20 feet, whichever is greater. And so in most towers are about 35 feet. It's almost always going to be a 20-foot height increase will be permitted by right if it's a wireless tower. For base stations and for anything in the right-of-way, it's 10% or 10 feet, whichever is greater. So like following the same analogy, most things in the right-of-way are about 25 feet. So it's usually going to be about 10 feet, maximum height increases. For width, for towers, it's either 20 feet or the width of the tower at the level of the appurtenance, meaning the mounting arms that hold the antennas. The width of the tower is a condition that usually only applies to big broadcast stations. It's mostly going to be about 20 feet for wireless towers. For base stations and anything in the right-of-way, it's 6 feet. So they can expand horizontally 6 feet from what they already have. A substantial change will always occur when it involves more than 4 equipment cabinets. So this doesn't mean 4 total at the site. It means that each request can include up to an additional 4 equipment cabinets. A substantial change occurs whenever there's any excavation outside essentially the footprint of the site. The rule is a little different based upon whether it's on private property or in the right-of-way. For private property, it's within the lease or license area. So if they want to dig into an area that they don't have the right to occupy, then that's going to be a substantial change. And for the right-of-way, it's, quote, the proximity, which is soft, but essentially it's anything outside the footprint of the ground-mounted equipment in the right-of-way. The next factor is whether the proposed eligible facilities request would defeat the existing concealment elements of the tower or base station. And this was, frankly, a bone that the commission threw to local governments who had put in a lot of work to make sure that the wireless towers that they did permit had stealthing and camouflage to blend them into the natural environment. And so the term defeat is hard to wrap your head around because it could mean a lot of things to a lot of people. The commission uses the 2 examples of you can't put new equipment on a facade and not paint it to match if the other equipment was painted to match. And you can't put an extension on a fake tree and not extend the fake foliage up to the height of the new extension. But those were the only 2 examples that they provided. So in order to throw out one more that we think is pretty reasonable, I've given you this photo here. This house here is actually a wireless tower because it's not a house at all. It was built for the sole purpose of supporting antennas, which are behind these sort of discolored panels here, right? I got the laser pointer on. As you can see, all of the antennas have been mounted behind the walls in order to preserve the concealment as a house. So if a carrier wanted to mount antennas to the exterior of the building, we might say that that's a substantial change because it defeats the concealment element of hiding the antennas behind the wall. Lastly, it's a substantial change if the proposed co-location would violate an enforceable prior condition of approval. And the reason why I have that in brackets is because not every condition of approval is going to be enforceable anymore. The main 2 criteria for an enforceable condition of approval is whether it would violate any of the thresholds for a substantial change. So you cannot condition a project to not get any taller than it already is. If under section 6409 it would be allowed to get up to next to 20 feet. And then each condition of approval needs to be essentially objective. There's no, the whole purpose behind these objective factors is to get away from the soft aesthetic analysis when you're talking about doing co-locations or modifications. So the FCC has required that an enforceable condition of approval be objective. The last phrase that's most critical to understand is what may not deny and shall approve means. At bottom, it means that the permit will be deemed granted if the local government hasn't acted on it within 60 days after the application is submitted. this is a big sea change, because as we talked before about the reasonable time, it was 90 or 150 days, and then at the end of those, the applicant had the option to sue for an injunction to force the local government to act. It didn't just get the permit. But the FCC has decided that the language "may not deny and shall approve" was strong enough to indicate that Congress wanted these projects to be moved through the process faster, and that at the end of 60 days, which was a reasonable time to run through that checklist of a substantial change, it should be deemed granted if it hasn't been acted on. An act means approve or deny. The period can still be told by mutual agreement, and some incomplete notices, as we talked about, it has to fall within the parameters of the first time it's been issued and citing to the publicly stated requirement for that particular missing application material. And it, like the shot clock, does not toll for a moratorium. And so I mentioned that this rule would be effective on April 9th. That's the inside date. We're waiting on whether the Office of Management and Budget, which oversees, procedural burdens on government entities, to decide whether this can go through. But at a maximum, I would assume that would only take an additional 30 days for them to approve it. So we're looking conservatively at this rule taking effect on April 9th of 2015. After the end of 60 days, the applicant has to provide written notice to the city before it starts to build, but after 60 days have run and after the notice has been given, the applicant can build. And so what that means is that you don't not just the zoning approval, but the building permit, the electrical permit, the encroachment permit, if it's required for like a right-of-way site, all have to be reviewed, processed, and acted on within 60 days. So as in the normal process where zoning happens first and then all those things happen if zoning is going to give it the okay, for these specific types of projects, so when it's an eligible facilities request and the presumption is it doesn't cause a substantial change, local governments need to start to process these things essentially simultaneously. The good news, if there is any, is that we don't need to go to DC to resolve disputes about this. They can be resolved in court. The idea is that if the project is deemed granted and a local government decides that it shouldn't have been, their remedy is to sue for an injunction against that deemed granted remedy. Vice versa, it works the other way. If the local government denies a project and the applicant thinks that it should have been deemed approved, or if it should have been approved affirmatively, they can sue for an injunction against the local government. But either way, you can see this rule kind of ends disputes in court only. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to may not deny and shall approve is conditional approvals. There was some concern that conditional approvals would be considered tantamount to denials, and therefore local governments couldn't attach conditions to these types of permits, whether they were going to affirmatively approve a 6409 permit or whether it would be deemed granted. But that's not true. The FCC has said that it's not tantamount to a denial, and so long as the condition doesn't try to frustrate the rights of expansion under the substantial change thresholds and uses objective criteria, it can still be attached to the permit. So this includes pretty normal things like drainage, landscaping, maintenance, indemnification, the things that you normally see attached to the back of a wireless permit. So now that you all know everything there is to know about telecom law, we can talk about what's going on with the ordinance revision. First of all, why was it necessary? Well, for compliance first. The changes in Section 6409 are so radically different from the way that local governments everywhere process wireless applications that virtually no one had a process in place that would make it compliant. And certainly no one had a process or an ordinance in place that would let their planners know that they had 60 days to do this or it was deemed granted, and that what was necessary to be in the incomplete notice or else it wouldn't be valid, certain things like that. So the ordinance needed to be updated for compliance to give guidance on those shot clock deadlines. And then also the ordinance included several prohibitions, which in and of themselves are not necessarily illegal, but there needs to be a mechanism or a safety valve to allow those prohibitions to bend a little bit when the federal law is going to preempt them. Additionally, the ordinance is going to have some improvements to the zoning preferences. We talked earlier about the least intrusive means being all about local values, and those local values have to be rooted in the local ordinance. So there needs to be some sort of authority that gives the decision-making body the grounds to make the decision that they're going to make. So as if in our height example, there needs to be a provision that says the height limit is X. But wireless sites come in all shapes, sizes, and kinds, and so these preferences need to be fleshed out. And so to the extent that we fleshed those preferences out so that the ordinance could tell applicants and planners what the range of acceptability of these projects are and how they should be processed in that way. And it also gives decision makers criteria for making decisions about whether to grant a permit or not. So I'm not sure how many of you have the draft ordinance in front of you, but I'll go through some of the provisions just section by section so that you can get a flavor of it and an idea of what's trying to be accomplished and what's the purpose of each. First is the definition section. As I mentioned before, a lot of the terms in the ordinances before Section 6409 was released were terms of art. They were self-defined inside the ordinance, but there wasn't any legal significance to those words in other contexts. But that's changed. Now words like wireless tower, base station, transmission equipment mean something important in the context of other laws, so it's important to have those consistent at the local level all the way up. So the definitions have been updated to be consistent with the federal definitions, and then we've pulled those directly out of the FCC rules. The next section is going to be applicability. Section 6409 applies to all things wireless. It applies to Wi-Fi, it applies to cell towers, it applies to broadband, it applies to amateur towers, it applies to satellite, anything that communicates without wireless that's approved or authorized by the commission. So not necessarily licensed, but just an authorized service. So to mirror that, the ordinance broadly applies to all wireless services and equipment. It applies to new sites, and it applies to changes in existing sites after the effective date of the ordinance, and it contains standard exemptions for municipally owned equipment, for public safety purposes, for amateur radio antennas that are governed under some other provisions of the law, and for what are called over-the-air receiving devices, or essentially small satellite dishes, which are also governed under a different area of the law. The next section is just application procedures in general. In order to maintain the difference between projects that will be deemed approved after 60 days and everything else that is subject to a different clock, the ordinance first divides the world into those two categories. If the applicant submits it and says that Section 6409 should apply, it's processed first as a design review. If the applicant submits it and says that no, we think this is not covered under Section 6409, it's submitted as a conditional use permit. There is a process for changing a design review to a conditional use permit if it's been discovered later that it would cause a substantial change, or that it doesn't involve a wireless tower or base station, or that we're not talking about transmission equipment. So there's some fluidity there, but at the outset, the applicant makes the decision about whether they want to apply for a design review permit because it's covered by Section 6409, or if they want to apply for a CUP because it's not. There's going to be an appointment process that's for the initial submittal. This rationalizes the inflow of applications, and it makes sure that no one just leaves an application on the planning counter at 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon and burns 3 days because the planners weren't aware that it was there or that it was covered by Section 6409. It also provides an opportunity for everybody who's from the different departments who will be involved in these projects that need to have approvals done within 60 days to get their hands on it, take a look at it, get a sense of what's going to be involved. But there won't be a requirement for an appointment for supplemental submissions, for returns to an incomplete notice, things like that. It's just to make sure that everyone's on the same page when the application is submitted. And then it also describes a process for sending out incomplete notices, which is essentially forward-looking information for planners so that they know it has to have certain citations in it, that it must reference certain issues, that it must be sent within a certain time frame. The next big section is regulations for facilities subject to a CUP. So this is everything that Section 6409 does not require approval for. It's new sites and big changes to existing sites. There's a detailed permit application requirement section which the director can waive or expand in writing on a case-by-case basis. And this, like we talked about before, is necessary because the applicant, the incomplete notice will have to cite to the required information. So to the extent we can foresee information that will be required for these applications, the draft ordinance includes all that information, and it can be modified later. It has detailed design standards and guidelines for all different types of sites, and it has clear factors for decision makers to evaluate whether to grant a CUP based upon those standards and guidelines. To give you an idea of what those guidelines are like, they're essentially break down into location preferences and design preferences that are ordered. They give you hierarchies of, which are the most preferred sites and which are the least preferred sites. In a nutshell, sites that are close to residential are most disfavored. And there is an exemption inside the draft ordinance that allows a lower priority location to be more preferred if the proposed site is actually closer to residential. That way, we're always keeping in mind that residential proximity is always least preferred. There's also location preferences that keep things away from landmark buildings, landmark trees, protected trees, ridge lines, and things like that. Design preferences always have a preference for stealth or camouflage. As you saw, one of the conditions for a substantial change is whether the proposal would defeat the existing camouflage. So it's a good idea to include camouflage on all these sites, especially in a city like Ojai that places a premium on its aesthetic character. And also there's a preference for the use of natural surroundings and existing structures to hide the equipment. So in addition to a building or a new site in an area where it's kind of tucked away is always going to be more preferred to a site that stands alone or that is a completely new structure. Regulations for design review deal specifically with Section 6409 projects. And so we'll spend a little bit more time on these because they are so new. In general, they break down into procedural guidance that are tailored to the FCC rules, limitations that apply to application materials that are imposed by the FCC, findings for approval that track those substantial change conditions we talked about earlier so that the director can go through and make sure that it qualifies, default conditions of approval that will apply whether the project was deemed granted by the operation of law or whether the director could make the findings to affirmatively approve the site, so the same conditions will apply no matter what. And then procedurals for denials without prejudice, which is a new concept we'll talk in depth about. First, it makes it clear that there's a 60-day review period and that and that the project will be deemed granted if the government fails to act. This is upfront, and it's a warning to planners to make sure that they know exactly what time frame is going to apply to these types of projects. There's limited application requirements. Essentially, the FCC has said that local governments can't ask for information about a project if it doesn't go to an issue within its local discretion. So, for the examples that the FCC gave were, you can't ask about service coverage, and you can't ask about the business case for a site. Because if you have to approve it based upon its physical size, and not about whether it will fill a significant gap or whether you need it for a business purpose, then there's no sense in asking those questions. So to the extent we have to pare back the application materials, we've done so. And then also there's a requirement that they submit all the applications for all the other permits they're going to need to get a site that's built with all the regular permits. So like building, electrical, encroachment, what have you, whatever is going to be required for that particular type of site. Next, there's several sections that include findings of approval that track the FCC rules. So we walked through when Section 6409 is going to require approval. These sections essentially break down into wireless towers on private property, base stations on private property, and everything else in the right-of-way. And then they state in explicit detail exactly what the director needs to find in order to determine that federal law requires approval. So if they can go through that whole list and say yes to each one of those, then Section 6409 applies and it must be approved. But remember when I said it was disjunctive, so if one of those conditions is not found, then it's a substantial change and it doesn't need to be approved. It would go through a conditional use process. But because it's a very complicated set of rules and it's difficult to understand, we've laid it out in checklist form. So that way, both the applicants and the planners and the director can look at this and say, okay, we know this is a wireless tower, we know it's in the right-of-way, here are the rules that apply, and we'll just run through them. Default conditions of approval. These are what we call self-executing conditions. They apply to deemed granted approvals, and so if for some reason the 60 days lapse and there hasn't been action and the project is deemed approved, then these conditions of approval will attach to the permit, just as if the director had written them into the permit themselves. The two most important ones are that it does not extend the CUP permit term. That way the site will essentially lose its permit and that the city will be able to bring it back into the zoning process. Granted, there's a mandatory 10-year term in most cases, but this is important, and it makes sense because if it's deemed granted, so the conditions automatically apply, the city didn't approve it. And even if it might have approved it, if the federal law requires it to, it shouldn't extend a discretionary approval. So that's included. And then second, the important one to keep in mind is that nothing in a deemed granted approval or an affirmative approval would waive the city's right to challenge the law itself or to challenge the deemed granted approval itself. So no one will ever be able to say that the city tacitly waived its right to complain about a deemed granted approval because it sat around and let it get deemed granted. The ordinance makes it clear that even deemed granted approvals are not done with the approval, the imprimatur of the city itself. It includes procedures for denial without prejudice. In most zoning cases, when an applicant receives a denial, it can't turn around and reapply for the application immediately. But we run into a problem with Section 6409 because what you're denying is not the site itself, but the process by which it was going to be approved. So a denial without prejudice doesn't mean that we don't want that applicant to be able to submit the permit application. It just means that it won't be approved automatically under Section 6409 by federal law. So when an application is denied without prejudice, the applicant can immediately refile that application in one of two ways. Either the way it is as a CUP because it's a substantial change and it doesn't qualify for mandatory approval, and therefore all the discretionary factors will apply, or with a modification to address whatever the issue was that made it a substantial change back under the Section 6409 design review process. This is important because if we were to deny a site and not let the applicant resubmit, you would essentially be effectively prohibiting the provision of their wireless services. And the interplay between Section 6409 and the Telecom Act requires that they be re-allowed to submit. And I'll bring up the point that it also reduces uncertainty in the case when maybe the applicant and the local government don't agree about whether it causes a substantial change. If there's a disagreement and 60 days passes, there's an open question about whether it was deemed approved. But if the local government decides that its position is that it causes a substantial change, it can issue that denial without prejudice, and there's never going to be a question about whether the deemed granted approval happened because there wasn't an active application to be approved. There's so moving outside of Section 6409, just as sort of the nuts and bolts part of the ordinance, there's an optional independent consultant review provision that allows the director to retain outside help on a case-by-case basis when it's needed. It's important for the city that does most of its planning work by contract. All the costs are billed to the city, but they are paid for by the applicant via deposit that's required as part of the application. The balance in the deposit for whatever is left over after the project review is completed is then returned to the applicant. Maintenance provisions in the ordinance require the sites to be kept neat, clean, and safe, comply with all laws at all times, and then maintain all of their approvals in good standing. These are fairly standard provisions in wireless ordinances. And then a removal of abandoned facilities provision that requires the permittee to remove their equipment and restore the site after it's remained unused for 180 days or after the permit is terminated or expired. And then the city can have the site removed at the permittee's cost if the permittee doesn't do so within a timely manner. This provision itself is rarely used, but it's a good tool to have in the box when it's needed. Ownership transfers requires the applicant or the permittee at that time to notify the city whenever it transfers its ownership. And the idea here is that we want to maintain an idea about who's responsible for the site, because notices need to go out to the permittee from time to time, and then if there's ever a code enforcement action, that we need to be able to identify who's responsible for it. Permit terms and conditions, as I mentioned before, under California law, development permits have to issue for at least 10 years unless some condition exists to require a shorter one. And those are if substantial health and safety reason or substantial land use reason requires a shorter one, then it's okay. Most of the time, it's going to be 10 years. So this provision makes sure that all permits granted under the, all CUPs granted under the ordinance are for 10 years only. And so as you remember, the 6409 design review permits don't affect that. When the permit expires, if they want to renew the permit, they don't have to remove their facilities, so we're not going to make them take it down and put it back up if everything is okay. There's a grace period there while there's a review for a permit renewal. But each permit renewal is approached as if it's a totally new site, because once the CUP expires, it still has a physical existence out in the field, but doesn't have a legal right to be there. And so it's essentially a new zoning review. And then lastly, and importantly, there's been an exception from standards added to the end of this ordinance. And it says, in a nutshell, that whenever federal law is going to require the zoning ordinance to bend, that whenever there's a variance that's going to be required because there's a significant gap and it's the least intrusive means, that the applicant is going to be allowed to deviate from the standards to the extent necessary under federal law. So not more, not less, and then it's going to require the applicant to make that showing by clear and compelling evidence.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Jonathan Kramer. I am here to deal with more of the policy issues, the top-level policy issues. I'm not going to speak for an hour. I doubt that I'll speak for more than about 2 minutes. It's important that you understand that the lecture that you just heard from Trip May, my partner, frames some important issues. Number one, it frames the fact that the wireless industry has been wildly successful at the federal level to prescribe our authority, to limit our authority, and therefore what has been proposed in the draft ordinance has been, to the maximum extent possible, designed to retain what we have and to do it within a legally constrained framework. Attacks on our authority continue. Between the last time we were here and now, Assembly Bill 57 was dropped into the hopper. Bill 57 is still in its preliminary stages, but it appears that it's going to be an attack on our rights to regulate our right-of-way. So we'll know more about it. That doesn't give us a good reason to wait on these regulations. In fact, it's just the opposite. We should move these forward. But this is an area where the tension is that people want wireless service and people also want to preserve community values. And this tension is reflected throughout the discussion that Tripp just gave you, and it's reflected through the ordinance. So we have, working with the city attorney and with staff, crafted these rules in an attempt to make those balances. We're hoping that you're going to give us your input and direction so that as we finalize these rules to bring back to first the Planning Commission for its recommendation and then to the City Council, that we best reflect community interests within those confined frameworks that we operate under federal law and under state law. So with that, I think Tripp's got a question comment session. I think the mayor should
Yes,
probably take the lead on this.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer, and thank you, Mr. May, for that presentation. I do want to ask the commissioners or my colleagues if they have any questions regarding the presentation or also regarding the draft on the ordinance with the wireless communication facility. Anybody have any questions? Councilmember Wyrick?
I have too many. But I'll start with one and then wait my turn for the next. And then I think the public is question. One overall question I want to ask about the 60 days. Given the broad definition of eligible facilities, you gave that answer, it could be the whole building. What happens if a modification to a building or, say, a modification on right-of-way involves other agency approval before they can get all of their permits? For example, if it affects the building in terms of how the circulation of pedestrian traffic is inside the building, the fire department may be involved. The right-of-way, Caltrans may be involved. If you're dealing with a site where maybe they find environmental contamination that there wasn't before, what does the city do on the 60-day deemed permit basis when you're waiting on another agency for approval and the 60 days is up? Do you have to go to court to say, stop?
The answer is no. You don't have to go to court. But the 60-day clock applies to the agency. So presumably each agency is under its own 60-day clock. If the 60-day clock runs out on the local government here and there's no other approvals required, like the fire department or so on and so forth, then the applicant can build. But if there are other approvals, they'll have to go and apply for those. They could presumably apply for them simultaneously. It would depend on whether those prior approvals from the local government are required to even apply for those other applications. But they cannot, the 60-day clock does not apply to all approvals required from all different agencies. It just, each agency has their own clock.
And those other agencies are under their 60-day too?
Yes.
From the time, and when does their clock start on the other agencies?
When their application is submitted.
So it's not the city's responsibility to forward that information to the other agencies?
Well, it depends on what the process is. If it's the city's normal process to, for example, forward the plans to the fire department, then that's not a separate application. That's done through our process.
Okay.
So
And what happens if the fire department doesn't come back in 60 days, doesn't act in 60 days in that example?
Yes, that's a very good question. And that question, like so many others, will inevitably be determined through lawsuits. But as a practical matter, if an agency doesn't come back, just like the 60-day rule presumes our approval if we don't act, I think a court's going to say, look, this is a 60-day rule that presumes approval. If you don't get back an objection within 60 days, within the period you need, it's probably that they're not going to have a right to object. That's the conservative lawyer's answer, and we'll see who litigates that question.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Councilmember Clapp?
Could you require that if there's a fire department involved, that it doesn't go through the city? That if there is some other agency that has to be part of the process, that it maintains a separate status so you don't end up with that responsibility?
It would depend on your own internal process. So if prior to section 6409 you have a connection with that other agency where you're part of their process, you would need to sever that in order to make it very clear. But like Jonathan said, those parts of the rules have not been thought out. The FCC is very good at creating rules that advance wireless deployment, but they're not great at thinking about the intricacies of each permitting stage. And so to the extent that that's something that they haven't thought of, the conservative answer is you need to get rid of those connections in order to make it completely separate. The objective answer is we don't know the answer because it hasn't come up yet in the rules.
The most likely answer is that, presuming we don't sever the process, and that's probably, because remember, we want to keep normal processes, so if we go to the fire department on everything else, we're probably still going to want to go to the fire department for this type of permit, but telling them, if they fail to give us their reply within X days, under the law, we have to presume their approval. We will presume their approval. And that gives them a fair warning.
Councilmember Haney?
Gentlemen, everything that I read into is at 6409 had to do with existing structures. Our issue was new structures. What's governs that, and then are we writing an ordinance to existing or writing an ordinance to new?
Both, yes. So yes, the first part of the ordinance that deals with CUPs and all the local preferences for the types of locations and site designs that are more preferred rather than less preferred, like stealthing, locations away from residential areas, landmark buildings. Those are all applicable to new sites. The second half of the ordinance dealing with design review, that's in place to deal with and address compliance with section 6409. So this proposed draft is tackling both. And that's frankly one of the reasons why it's being proposed as a chapter rather than a section that you had in place beforehand. The section was not broad enough. It would get very complicated with all the different changes that are being made here.
Anybody else have any questions? Looking down. Yes, Commissioner.
In a home area, if a tower's going up, the homeowners, do they come in that 60-day? If there's a notice sent out to them that a tower's going to be built, do they have that 60-day? And if they don't respond to it, does it go that they are happy with it too?
Are you asking about like a notice and an appeals
to homeowners
process?
in a residential area, so in the 60-day process, does that apply to them as well, the homeowners?
Well, they'll get notice of it, but if they want to appeal it, the way that the federal rules are laid out, that appeal might take place in a courtroom rather than in a council chambers, because after that 60-day process, the application is considered to be deemed approved, and there is no extension there except by a tolling agreement, which you would have to get agreement from the applicant in order to allow that appeal process to take place.
Just a bit more on that. When we're talking about the 60-day process, we're talking about a modification to an existing cell site. Not a new cell site, and not a cell site that is a substantial change, but an existing cell site. And in that situation, the FCC does not presume public comment. It really doesn't care about public comment. It cares about size, objective factors that Tripp has discussed. So unfortunately, the reality is that for modifications that do fall within 6409, then the public is really not a great participant in this process, and as Tripp indicated, their recourse under the federal law is to sue. And unfortunately, the reality is, who are they going to sue? They would probably end up suing both the wireless company and the city. That's a reality. Now, this gets back to why the front end of the ordinance is so important to the back end. The front end of the ordinance objectively talks about important things like camouflaging, size, zone limits, and so forth because of one word. One word in 6409 as defined by the FCC, and that's defeat. Because your new site applications, presuming that they'll be camouflaged, and as Tripp has indicated, we expect that they will be, your level of detail on what the camouflage is and why it's important will become critically important, not for the approval of the new site, but later on when an application comes in to modify it, because then using your values, you will have to determine whether that application defeats the camouflage. So the front end of the ordinance is important because it gives you, within the scope of the legal authority, your ability to say, nope, what you're proposing would defeat the camouflage, because look, we have all of these specific requirements for camouflage at the front end. And what you're proposing now would defeat that. And that would then put it back into a conditional use process. The goal here is not to deprive a wireless company of its 6409 rights, but it's also to balance those rights against the city's ability to preserve its zoning control to protect the aesthetics of the community. Remember, we don't regulate technology. We're not allowed to regulate technology, but we are permitted, as Tripp said, we're allowed by federal law until we're not, to regulate community aesthetics. So that's really become paramount, and that's why so much of time has been spent on those issues.
Any other questions, fellow commissioners or council members?
Mayor?
Yes.
I did have a question or a comment that I thought might be elaborated on. One of the biggest issues that we came across when we had a cell tower application had to do with locations, alternate locations, and preferred locations. And so I was wondering if Tripp could maybe go through the section that starts on page 6 of 19 that talks about how we prioritize different potential locations.
All right, and since I don't think everybody in the audience has this language, I'll just read it to you since it's not that long. So the subject of this section is preferred locations, and it starts, to minimize aesthetic and visual impacts to the maximum extent feasible, all new telecommunication facilities shall be located according to the following preferences, ordered from most preferred to least preferred. First, parcels owned or controlled by the city, parcels owned or controlled by other government entities, parcels principally used as a golf course, parcels or rights-of-way in agricultural zones, parcels of rights-of-way in industrial zones, parcels or rights-of-way in commercial zones, parcels or rights-of-way in open spaces, and parcels or rights-of-way in residential zones. And I'll continue on with the exceptions and then disfavored locations. So the next subsection states that regardless of whatever the preferences are in that ordered list, if a proposed facility in a less preferred location shall always be more preferred than a facility within 100 feet of a residential use, measured from the nearest point of the proposed facility to the property line within the residential use. So, in this example, if you want to propose something in an agricultural zone, but it's within 100 feet of the residential use, something in an industrial zone, which is technically a lower preference, would be more preferred because it's farther away from residences. Next, most strongly disfavored locations. No facility shall be permitted or constructed in a location where it would extend above a ridgeline, impact the scenic viewshed, impact a protected tree, or impact a landmark property. And those are the location preferences for new sites.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, Commissioner.
Go ahead.
Do you imagine supplying the commission with a tool or a series of tools that we can use to really clarify where the landmines are and how to best really craft something that reflects community values?
We would have to work with the city manager and the community development department to develop something like that, but I would have to get back to you on the answer for that.
Councilmember Wyrick.
The 100 feet and the exception for facilities proposed for proximity to residential uses, I assume that 100 feet is subject to local discretion. That's not mandated by federal rules. It could be less, it could be more.
It could be modified. The 100 feet comes from setback in the current ordinance that's existing now, so it's sort of been grandfathered in.
Well, that's 30 yards.
I understand the
Not a lot.
the difference here is that if you want to extend that something longer, you need to keep in mind that if it's so long that there's nowhere within the city that you could be.
I understand, you can't have the effect of prohibition.
Sure.
But in other words, there's nothing absolutely sacrosanct about the 100 feet. It could be adjusted.
It could be adjusted.
Okay. And then a follow-up to that. Is there any problem with the fact that the core of the city includes both city-owned land and a special zone called a village mixed use, which is commercial and residential together?
So,
in other words, permissive to be next to each other. Do we have to think through that a little bit?
well,
in terms of how we establish the priorities, so we don't end up with a cell tower near the tennis courts or something like that?
the exception would probably cover that rule, but we
Well,
could.
if it was, I can see parts of maybe the park that are further than 30 yards from, houses,
Well, then
for
we'll
example.
then we'll go back and study that issue to make sure that we don't inadvertently channel these things.
I'm
in
just
preference.
asking the question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Commissioner Nolan.
Yes, thank you. This kind of goes along the lines of the question that Commissioner Zabila brought up, and she was asking for some guidelines. We may want to develop a map. I mean, for instance, it says protected trees. I think we should be thankful that we have a valley that's full of protected oaks and sycamores, but we may want to provide some sort of a map in addition to guidelines that just indicated, what we have here as far as landmarks, protected trees, and what have you. Just a suggestion.
Anybody else? Yes, Commissioner. You're gonna have Chester.
Yeah, going along those lines, it seems like the local values aspect of this is the most powerful tool that we have for our discretion as planning commissioners, correct? Would you say?
That's correct.
Okay, so that's, I do feel that a powerful tool in that way would be to define that more clearly, so we would have a checklist. We would have some, and I think the map is a great idea. It gives us some idea or a consensus of what that really means.
Well, one thing to bear in mind about the CUP process is that it's a great idea to flesh out exactly what your local preferences and values are. It's a better idea to make sure that you have those ordered, but you don't want to lock yourself into any specific, check the box, you get X amount of points, because every piece of property is different and every site could be designed differently. So if, for example, we had a hard and fast rule that said you must do building mounted, but for some reason, in some particular location, a fake tree actually looked better. You want to leave the flexibility to work on both sides to make sure that you have the opportunity to pick the better design. If I misunderstood your question, please let me know.
Well,
Go ahead.
Yeah, you could follow up.
Well, local values is a subjective term, and somehow I think we have to define it a little bit better.
Okay.
Okay, to be able to have some guidelines.
Local values are found in a number of places, general plan. We don't want to establish a separate community values for this one area. To the extent that we are adopting and using general community standards, that's actually more enforceable. We'll go back and look at this issue, but we look to the entire body of the city's code, not to create a special carve-out here that would somehow change the community values as to wireless, because that's suspect. That would be suspect. So the general values that you apply when you're looking at a new home, applying for a new home, that's kind of the neighborhood we're talking about being in, because those are the community values that apply across the board.
Councilmember, Mayor Pro Tem Blatz.
Yes, my question is this. Are all of the applications going to go before the Planning Commission?
No. The CUPs will. The design reviews, because they take place in such a short period of time, are slated for director level approval. This is not set in stone. The Section 6409 tells local governments what they must do, but not how they must do it. As a practical matter, it would be difficult to get a public notice and hearing done within the 60-day time frame, because as we mentioned, you're also going to need to complete the building permit review and other things like that. But it's not impossible or illegal. So if you would like to look into that, that's something that could be examined.
Okay, so what we're looking at here tonight is, we're looking at this proposed ordinance that's gonna go to the Planning Commission for their input and review, and then it's gonna come to the council for ultimate approval in March. So if we decided we wanted to have public input on all of the projects, even though there may not be a lot of latitude in the approval, but at least give the public an opportunity so that they could come and be heard about a project, we could build that into the ordinance, even though that's not in the proposed ordinance, correct?
Again, because 6409 does not involve the public, unfortunately, it involves things and sizes.
Okay, that would be on any modification.
Right.
I'm talking about new construction.
Oh, that's covered now.
Okay.
It's only, the problem on 6409 is just, it's different.
Okay.
But what you're talking about in terms of new sites and modifications that are substantial changes, that's a public process.
Right, well, the substantial changes, it'll have to go there for the CUP. But new sites, that is a public process.
Correct.
Okay.
You know, and it brings up an idea, just to throw it out there, is that there's no reason why public notice can't occur, even if a public hearing doesn't have to occur. So something like that could be built in.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to turn it back to the public because I have some speakers cards. So I'm going to go with the speaker cards first, and then I'll let anybody else ask questions. And then I'll turn it back to council, and then I'll go back to the public for further questions. So we'll start off with Michael Francis Smith.
Members of the City Council, members of the Planning Commission, I ask you, do your heads hurt? Do you understand even half of what we've just been told tonight? Seriously. So I'm asking that you all please respectfully, that you sharpen your pencils and that you start asking the very difficult questions, and that you really, really uphold the values. Maybe we have not articulated them properly or carefully enough, but they exist. So that your community is really counting on you. It's obvious that our federal government has very little regard for the public's input, and here in Ojai we have a different way of being. So I'm asking each of you individuals that are sitting on the Planning Commission and on our City Council to please step up, or this is going to go in a very strange way. Because we know that telecommunications companies are targeting schools. That's where they want to place these towers. Are we all okay with that? I know we're not allowed to talk about the health effects of the microwave radiation, but do we really want that overhead our children who have unmyelinated brains in development here in Ojai? I'm aghast at what we've heard tonight. I know that no one cares, or everyone wants to limit our ability to object, but I have an objection to that. So we have a new city council elected. I ask that you all please take your oaths very seriously. I work with an organization called Ojai Neighbors Engaged. We will be available to articulate the community standards. Please call upon us. We're here, we're active, we're very concerned about this issue. We have not gone away. And one more thing before I step down from this, I'm very disappointed, Mr. Clark, at the process of disseminating very important information. We have a meeting tonight. This workshop is supposed to be about the proposed ordinance. We have been asking for copies of this proposed ordinance for weeks. And we were given it just tonight. And I further understand that a private meeting was called where you invited industry to come in and comment about the proposed ordinance while you kept it from the public. It's simply unacceptable, and I'm extremely personally disappointed. And I ask that the council take special attention to this. This won't stand anymore. You have an intelligent public. We're very concerned about this situation. We've studied up. And I heard what was said, that our ability to object is limited. That means that we have to step up our activity. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, Council Member.
Mr. Mayor.
Clapp, just real quick. Yeah, Council Member Clapp.
I have a real brief question. The question of school districts, pardon me, we have no jurisdiction over school districts. They're a separate entity, are they not? So the decision whether there was to be a cell tower on a school district, school property would be the decision of the school board, is that correct?
Only in part, because cell towers are not core to an educational function. The school district would approve a lease, but it would still come to us for zoning approval, even though it's on school property. So that there's a carve out. For clarification purposes, the meeting that was held with the wireless industry did not give them a draft of the ordinance. It was to discuss points and elements. They have not seen the ordinance before the public, of course. Because we wanted to make sure that we had technical details, so we talked about technical details. But please be sure that the industry has not been favored in any way through this process.
Okay, thank you. And I do apologize if you guys didn't get the ordinance. I thought we pretty much made it clear.
Mayor, the meeting was posted. It was mailed out. I emailed everyone that had come to previous meetings. They were aware of this meeting. I also did send Michael Francis the packet, I believe. I've sent other people the packet, so they did have the ordinance that is in the packet tonight, and it was also on the website, and I told them to go to the website to check. And they could always call me and get a copy.
And I do want to point out also that in the drafted ordinance, our values of our general plan are included. So if you haven't had the opportunity to take a look, I do urge you, because it is included on the draft ordinance. Mr. Daddy?
Good evening. You sure went through that fast, and I catch on fairly fast. It would be really nice if we could get, what do I want to say, just a little bit of a do-over. So I got a couple of separate issues. Right away, they can apply for 10 feet or percentage, they're going to get the 10 feet. The other one, they can apply for a percentage or 20 feet, they're going to get the 20 feet. But you also said before that they had to adhere to the local area and the community standards, and that we had to articulate those standards. A few months ago, we went ahead and we changed the height ordinance within the city. And we made that a 25-foot, subject to some changes. Solar shed, a few other things that we're still kicking around that aren't, I don't believe in cement yet. You also said that view sheds couldn't be impaired, that we still had the right to view sheds. So the question is, if somebody has a solar in the right, or a tower in the right of way, do they get 10 feet automatically? How many times? Every time they want to turn in a new application? Once every 10 years? Once every 2 months? Because if they're going to get 10 feet every time, 10 times that adds 100 feet to the 60 feet they got. And so where do we then stop this with the view sheds, and where do we stop this with the 25 height? So if someone could get us some communication on those technical aspects, because that's what we're looking in here for those technical aspects. And I would like to see those things that we have in our standards and those things we have in the new ordinances, where they are and where that's going to help us with this. Because these things could go, there is no regulation if it's a 20-foot slam dunk each time. That's the way I see it. So if you could explain some of that things and where we have the protections and what we do, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daddy. And yes, could our legal counsel answer those questions?
So, yeah, thanks. Through the mayor, I'll tell you that Section 6409 preempts all the local values that are set in place for new sites and for substantial changes to existing sites. So, to the extent that the 20-foot or 10-foot height extension that's permitted under the law violates the zoning height limit or would impact a view shed, they can build. Now, the other question was, how many times do they get that 10-foot or 20-foot extension? It's, as I mentioned, a cumulative limit. It creates an invisible envelope around the tower or base station that carriers can build within, but not above. So, if, in the example, it's a wireless tower on private property, so the height limit is 20 feet. They build up to 20 feet. Everything above every inch above 20 feet is discretionary. But let's say that tower comes down from that 20 feet, they can build back up, but they can't go over. And so it's within that sort of invisible envelope around each structure that is set by the thresholds in a substantial change. So to sum up, the zoning ordinances and all the local preferences are preempted by Section 6409 to the extent they don't match up with the physical change limits, but the physical change limits are cumulative. There is a hard limit to the number of, or to the size that they can expand.
So if I understand, it's not cumulative effect. It goes back, measures from its original build, right? They can't add 10 feet and then say, oh, we want another, to add another 10 and another 10 because it goes back to the original. Right.
The concept was described to the FCC as tower creep. So they just get successive, less than substantial changes. They can build however big they want. But the FCC said, no, we get that. That's not the way the rule should be. So there is a hard limit on the size of expansion. That size is rather large. It could be 10 or 20 feet taller, but it is a limit.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lobo?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. May I approach the dais to provide you two documents?
Yeah, do it if you want. Send it to our...
Mr. Kramer just represented that there was no ordinance presented to, well, first let me back up. I'm here under protest because I don't believe that the Public Records Act was complied with. The letter in the manila envelope covers that. It's directed to you. Because of the time it was received, the documents from Mr. Clark and through Ms. Besor, I didn't have time to print more documents. First of all, Mr. Kramer just stated that the draft wireless ordinance was not provided at the meeting on December the 9th. The documentation provided by Ms. Besor at approximately 2:40 this afternoon specifically says, and in that envelope there has it, draft wireless ordinance for discussion purposes only, and it's attached to the mailings to the industry representatives. So either the information got mixed up or something else happened, but I can tell you that the impression left on people who were taken advantage of by the city's misconduct with respect to the 1290 grant application and the failure to provide proper notice feel that we're being cheated again. So with that said, let's move on to the actual points that I put out because there's no way that I could cover everything else. But I think that the citizens' respect for this body is dependent upon transparency. I have a couple of basic questions. One of which is there a higher limit on the application cost that you can charge? By my calculation, the city charged AT&T $17,831.41 for their retracted application. Is that fair? Is that reasonable? I think normally you tell me it's a reasonable test. What is it, and how can we get that as high as possible? And I don't know if you can deal with that now. My second general question is, we haven't heard any discussion about DAS or other infrastructure-supported cellular deployments, which I will tell you right now, I don't understand. But my question is, if you use the light poles and other types of
cellular delivery services, can you avoid having poles built because there is no need, because they have to use the infrastructure that you have created as the city?
So if you want to,
Or I can go on and give the rest of my comments if that makes it easier. And
I do want to make sure that we answer your questions, and I guess if you could answer his first two. All right, so if we get all your questions first, we'll answer each one, and I'm making note of him too. So.
My next general comment is transparency and public notice. Mayor Pro Tem Blatz mentioned, how do we know what's going on? Public input. I hope that there's a way that even if there is not an opportunity for public input on the 6409 issues, that at least we know what's going on, that before a director acts or doesn't act, that we know. And I hope that there's a way to make that clear to the public. Also, I think that there are some areas where you've talked about environmental risk, but there's a number of areas that have been avoided, and again, it's all on page 2 of my comments. One of the issues that came up at 1290 Grand was that there was going to be 24-hour air conditioning service, which was going to cause a noise issue. Certainly, if you're in the middle of a freeway, it doesn't make any difference, but when you're sitting out in a field, in what is surrounded by residential or 3 sides residential areas, it does make a difference when it's absolutely quiet there at night. And there was no baseline used that was a reasonable baseline of basically 0, which is what it would be at 9 o'clock at night. The alternate site analysis that's contained within this ordinance, I wasn't clear how it was strong enough to make. In one case, they say that the director can allow them not to have 5, but can reduce the number. Why wouldn't you make it as strong as possible to make the wireless industry demonstrate what other choices there are, rather than just give you one that happens to be a willing lessor and move on? Also, I think that there's issues with respect to the easement and the effect on the easement for access, not just the tower site, but how you get to it. I know we talk about protected trees, but why is it that we don't talk about all trees when we talk about removal? In the case of 1290, they were going to take out a bunch of or several of the protected trees, but why should we have them take out any trees? And also, the so-called camouflaging, it's kind of odd to camouflage with a eucalyptus tree when you got a bunch of sycamores that are deciduous sitting there. That doesn't seem to me camouflage at all. It's just a large plastic pole. And can the ordinance be more carefully articulated to deal with that? Also, I notice the city is exempted from the ordinance, but the school district is not. And the school district has towers of some variety, or antennas on every one of their buildings. And I'm not necessarily in favor or disfavor, but they have some issue with respect to that, I would think. And I noticed that you want to restrict the height, but you let ham radio go up to 70 feet. Does that then defeat your ability to say, well, we let one group do it, but not the other? I also have a whole bunch of specific comments, which I don't want to take over for everyone else, but things like they're on page 1-3, remove the general term minimally include, replace with a clear and complete written statement. There's a number of areas in here which I honestly didn't understand, and that's why I provided it in writing for you. We don't have to go over it now, but there's some places in there where it honestly, I understand that you had a very tight drafting challenge, but if we can't understand it, I'm not sure that makes it an intelligible ordinance. So I guess I want to cede I don't want to take up all your evening when I've written it all down for you anyway, but I would ask that the council at least consider those items. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lobo. And could Mr. Kramer or Mr. May answer the questions? I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 questions.
I'll provide copies of this tomorrow. There weren't enough for the Planning Commission and the City Council, and provide it to Mr. Kramer and Mr. May too.
And I got 11.
You got 11.
We're in the
votes, so you
same
got-
neighborhood. And through the mayor, for Mr. Lobel, I appreciate his thoughtful comments. Let me start taking them, I hope, in the order that he provided. We did not, it was an error. We didn't provide a draft of the ordinance to the wireless industry at the meeting. We provided a skeletal framework, and it was a very skeletal framework. So there was no draft provided. Nothing even remotely close to being a workable ordinance. It was basically for our purposes to have talking points to make sure that we cover the important issues that would contribute towards a wireless ordinance. In terms of a higher limit on applications, this refers to Mr. Lobel's comments on fees. Under California law, we're not allowed to make a profit on wireless applications or other types of applications. We're allowed to recover our fees. And that's a good thing, both because it protects applicants of all types, and number two, it also allows us to recover our fees so that the city is not gifting its services to any applicant. So that's the balance point. So that there isn't a specific right number, and as Tripp indicated earlier, under the FCC rule, the commission has made it very clear that they understand that this is a highly technical area, and they expect that local governments will need outside help. But think about 6409, where the zoning process and the permitting process have to occur simultaneously. That's very common for many jurisdictions to then sub that work out of the building a safety end to companies that do that work as well while they're doing the zoning. So recovery of the city's costs is very important so that the city doesn't become a sponsor of a wireless company. That's a very important comment. He asked about DAS or other technologies, and as I said earlier, we're not allowed under federal law to regulate technology. We're allowed to regulate aesthetics and how a wireless provider wants to provide its services within their purview, but within ours is the community aesthetics. And that's why the draft of the ordinance and the spirit of the ordinance is to protect the community aesthetics, because that's what we're allowed to do. If we say that we prefer one technology over another, there actually been court cases on that the local jurisdictions have lost. So we have yet another limit under law that we have to abide within. Public notice. The issue of public notice is, to the extent that it's out there for the conditional uses, it's certainly going to be followed. In terms of other ways and I believe Mr. Lobel was talking about giving notice for even the non-discretionary projects. Some jurisdictions have talked about simply putting applications that come in on their website to give the public information about it, not notice. Remember, public notice is a very specific thing legally. But to keep the community involved and informed, that certainly is something that you could do, and it wouldn't go into the ordinance. It would simply be a council directive to staff. It's not a suitable subject for the ordinance because, frankly, public notice is something very special under law. And we don't want to conflate public notice with keeping the public notified. So you can do that separately if that's the will of the council. In terms of the noise issue that he raised, the city has a noise ordinance, and it applies to wireless sites as well. This is logical because the standard is not no noise. The standard is whatever is in the noise ordinance because it's a generally applicable safety code. And if, as an example, a wireless company came in for a modification under 6409, the one that says may not deny and shall approve, if it violates the noise ordinance, that would actually violate a generally applicable safety code, which would then take it out of 6409. It's not generally applicable if we craft a rule specifically for wireless. Okay? Again, there's a kind of a huge puzzle to how all of this works. He's right. This is very complicated stuff. He got that right. And how all this fits together, we're doing this for the first time, as he appropriately noted, and I thought it was very thoughtful of him to do it. And this stuff is coming down pretty fast. And we have an opportunity to do it right as best we can the first time. This is not the only time the city has the bite of this ordinance, but as court cases come down, as rules are clarified, it's very likely that revisions will be brought back to you, but they'll be based on court cases, not just, well, this doesn't quite feel right. And I don't mean to suggest that he did that. He was concerned about the alternate site analysis and why the director can reduce that alternate site analysis. Here's a very good example why. If a wireless site is proposed, let's say it's behind a parapet, it will not be seen at all, zero, completely invisible. Then arguably there is no better site if it meets all the zoning criteria, the zone criteria that Tripp read in earlier. So if it's in the appropriate zone and it's invisible, well, that really achieves the maximum result under the ordinance. So reducing the number of alternative sites because you've got the best one, the one that's completely invisible, makes the most sense. Now, I'm not talking about a new structure, I'm talking about an existing structure that's modified in that way. Easement to access, we're not in the easement business. We don't control easements. That's a private issue between property owners. So we're here for the purpose of zoning projects. And this does come up, he was right to raise it. This comes up as to who has the right to use what easement. It's not your determination. You're not a court that sits in judgment as to who has the rights to an easement. We have courts that do that. So that's why it's not a suitable subject for the ordinance. Why not protect all trees, not just the protected trees? And again, this is consistency with the city's code. The more we are consistent with the city's code, the way that the planning commission reviews projects, the way that then the city council might take it on appeal, as we follow the city's process already established, it's generally applicable. When we start making carve-outs, and I've said it before, but it's important to repeat it, when we make a carve-out for a specific type of service, and especially when we do it for wireless, it becomes suspect and probably unenforceable. If we say that only protected trees are protected in the city, but if it's a wireless site, every tree is protected, we lose. It's bottom line. Camouflage, the type of camouflage. Every cell site is different. And that's why we have thoughtful people who sit on the planning commission to review these projects. And that's why you review them if they come up to you on appeal. But it's hard to say one size fits all. And that's why there's enough flexibility in the ordinance to look at what the property is, where it is, how it's constructed, what the project is within the property. All these things go in. As I said earlier, though, really the most important thing is that whatever the camouflage is, that it be really adequately described in the planning commission's conditions of approval, because that becomes the key later on for 6409 to determine whether a modification would defeat the camouflage that was so carefully put in by the planning commission, and presumably, if it came up to you, was approved by you, so that if a project comes in that would defeat that very carefully planned camouflage, it wouldn't be denied per se, but it would require the conditional use process. Again, if you think about a giant jigsaw puzzle, you can see how all these pieces kind of fit in. We've got pieces here, we've got pieces there. Finally, two last items. He raised the issue about the city's exemption, but the schools are not. And cities are traditionally exempted from their own rules because we build public safety radios. We build radio sites that save people's lives. So to make sure that that is not constrained by our own ordinance, that's why a city is exempted from the ordinance. Now, schools are not, because as I indicated earlier, schools are still subject to local zoning if it's for an antenna not related to educational use. Let's say a school district wants to put up an antenna system so that they can communicate with their janitors and their teachers and their staff. That's outside of our purview. That's actually subject to the state architect, the division of state architect. But if it's not affiliated, if it's not a radio system that is for the purpose of the school's activity, its educational function, then it's within our purview, and we're making sure that it comes to you. And finally, he raised the issue of amateur radio towers, and that's actually covered by two separate bodies of law. Number one, there's a federal rule on point called PRB1, which federally, the FCC has said, ham radio is special, and you local governments around the country, the minimum amount of regulation, it's got to be hands-off for more than the minimum amount of regulation. Now, not only did the FCC say that, but California adopted its own PRB1 law. So there's both a federal code and a state code that gives special status to ham radio, which is frankly why we pulled it out of here, because this isn't the place to try and do that specialized regulation. I want to conclude this by saying I think he had some very thoughtful comments. I'm sorry that we had some confusion as to what was provided to the industry, that framework. It wasn't a wireless ordinance. That's our bad. And we have carefully provided all of the information that is public record tonight. I'm sorry, up till tonight. And I know that the city attorney who I spoke with this afternoon has made it very clear that all of the information provided tonight will also be sent out. Any new information that comes in, even his own documents are going to be returned to him because they came in as part of the record. So we will honor our obligations under the California Public Records Act as we have to now. And I turn it back to the mayor.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kramer. Next speaker card, Joe Haddon.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, commissioners, planning commission, city council. Tonight we had a very...
If you could please talk in the mic, because people are actually viewing this at home and they can't hear you if you don't talk into the mic.
I'm not that big. Yeah. Anyway, Mr. May's exposition was lucid as dewdrops of one syllable. And this was a very prolix bit of legislation, but I thought he did an excellent job of summarizing it. Back in the beginning, when we had the original ordinance, we went over it, this hall would have been filled, sparsely filled tonight, because everybody sort of subsided as the city council went into regrouping. But when this first reached our ears, and we had very short time to respond to it, the city rose up as one with a roar of indignation. But Mr. Kramer, I have done some research, and he has been held out as an exemplar of knowledge in this field, and I feel we're very fortunate, and the city was very wise in employing his services, and I take it as tacit approval of Mr. May's comment that he endorses. Yes, and just to go through the proposed statute, you've got to realize that this is enormously more complex, and somebody talked about building a Eiffel Tower, something building it with Legos, you just go up 10 feet at a time. This statute has been ordinance has been very well thought out. In the late 30s, there was a movie involving an escaped primate who was goaded into climbing the Empire State Building. And here we were only dealing with a 65-foot tower over a church, over a cowering nursery school at the foot of that tower. And yet that 65-foot tower would have been visible to great portions of the city. And this is a city or village that prides itself on aesthetics, and to whom aesthetics mean a lot. This is what you might describe as a very granola city, and we all take pride in that. And we appreciate the thought, I know, that went into drafting this ordinance. The great numbers that crowded the city hall when they had the preliminary hearings on this aren't here tonight. They felt that the thing was on its way, safely launched, and my best impression is it is well launched. And I appreciate the time and effort that's gone into it. I think we're all better off for it. We needed it. The other older ordinance had some comments about aesthetics, but they were very ethereal. no solid footing on it. And even the utterances in that initial ordinance were heavily tromped on by AT&T. So tonight we come out as armored as an armadillo, and I think it's due to, in large part to the wisdom of the city council and to its anointed representatives here tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hayden. Ms. Michelle Thomas.
Hi, I'm Michelle Thomas, 1125 Del Prado Court, and I just have a few comments that I came up with while I was listening. First of all, I want to personally, publicly acknowledge my appreciation for all the time, thought, and effort by my fellow citizens, council members, planning commission, and our consultants, although I realize you're paid for it. I appreciate all of this effort on this extremely important issue. Please do what you can to preserve all the trees, all the open space in our mixed village, all the wetlands. There's a lot of areas that aren't designated as what they really are. Just think about that. Lastly, I have to say, I'm a technophobe. When I appreciate the fact that everything's being put on the city website, unfortunately, as a technophobe, a lot of times I have a basic computer, it works sometimes. I don't have a printer. I don't have the ability to get the information that you're giving out sometimes and read it ahead of time. So I'm going to publicly request that I get mailings of things that I need to know. And we all know that I've been pretty involved in this issue. And maybe there's other citizens that need that kind of help also. So just a thought, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Etta Hayden.
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity to let us speak to you. Many of us here, as my husband pointed out, have been, I'll call it, quote, sensitized by a prior circumstance involving the Grand Street proposal. And after all this time, we've come together, and now a new ordinance has been proposed, and many of us are interested in examining that and having an opportunity to comment. So I just need some clarification on timing. Is the hearing, the proposed ordinance is going to come up for review by the Planning Commission on February 3rd? And then after that, it goes to the council on February 27th? So if I wanted to make any kind of comment before all of this got completely finalized, when would you want to have that information?
You actually have many bites at this apple. You can provide comments to the Planning Commission. You can provide comments to the City Council. Both will be public hearings. You can provide comments even before, based on the draft. In fact, to the extent that you think that there's some things that should be changed in the draft before it goes to the Planning Commission, you should write the city now and let us know about those things.
All right, well, that was the timetable I was looking for. If I want to get it before the Planning Commission makes their final review, when would I be sure to have that considered?
Well, you can have it considered up to and including at the Planning Commission hearing. Now, the Planning Commission hearing is not going to be a vote to approve or deny. It's a vote to recommend to the City Council.
Well, no, I understand that.
Okay.
Okay. That was my main question. My other question for clarification, and I agree with you, Mr. Kramer, that probably one of the most important areas is the initial review for a new application, because you really are going to set the stage for all future tower modifications. So it's really, really important to get it right the first time. And I'm going to use hypothetically the example of the tower that came under fire. Their initial proposal was for a 65-foot tower. Then during a session similar to this, they said, oh, well, we'll agree to modify it down to 55. So hypothetically, assuming they had modified it down to 55, do they now, if they come back for a modification, can they increase that to 75, 85? I guess that's my question. Is that the actual impact of what might happen?
For reasons that I think are obvious, I don't want to talk about a specific project, so I'll answer your question in general.
Perfect.
If a project is approved by through the mayor, I apologize.
No, that's fine.
That's one of the formalities of this, is I have to say through the mayor.
Okay.
Magic words. If a project is approved by the city and the height is 30 feet, just a number, then under 6409, if it comes back and a wireless applicant who got a 30-foot approval said we want to build it to 50, that's only one of the criteria that's evaluated by the city to determine whether we have to give them that permission. But up to a maximum, presumably, of 50 feet, because the original project would have been approved at 30.
Yes.
And they have up to 20 more feet, subject to it staying within the confines of 6409.
So in this ordinance, the original height proposal is extremely important.
The height, through the mayor, the height proposal is important. The height of a site is important, but also as you can tell, even more important than the height is the design of the site.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, I wasn't speaking loudly. It's the design of the
design.
site.
Okay.
Because because the objective standard under the FCC rule is that they're allowed to get 20 feet higher, then you have to look at whether that stays as a mandatory approval under 6409, or if it falls out of 6409, it comes in as a conditional approval. Once it's out of 6409, the 20 feet, 10%, 10-foot rule, all those go away. And it just comes back into our normal conditional use process. So that's why I personally think the design of the original site is critically important to making sure that any modifications to it are not granted automatically, but they go through whatever level of scrutiny is appropriate under the law. I'm couching my words here, not trying to.
And could I, if you mind, can I interject, Mr. Craner?
Please.
And if I may, if I'm understanding your question correctly, is you're already talking about a new facility that I think she's presuming that it's a new facility, so it's a conditional use permit procedure.
No, actually, I'm not. I'm
Oh,
saying the conditional use permit has been granted, the tower's there.
Oh, really?
It's
Okay.
55 feet.
Okay, so yeah.
Now
so
they come in for a modification, and I understand you have to look at several different aspects of that. But just looking at that one concept, does that mean that automatically, if they come in for an application to increase it by 20 feet, that permit has to be granted?
It's not automatic if it causes a substantial change that Tripp's already described, or if that modification defeats the camouflage.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood. I thought a substantial change, that it would not be considered a substantial change if it was 10%, or in this hypothetical, 20 feet.
It wouldn't be a substantial change for height purposes, but as an example, let's say that the camouflage below is crosshatches, and then what they're proposing above are flat surfaces. Well, that would I think would probably be one of the things that could be considered to defeat the camouflage of the original site, because having inconsistent camouflaging would be in fact more visible than having camouflage. This is the softest area, through the mayor, of the rules, and that's why it's the most important to evaluate. We can't give you a better answer than this because it's a very fact-specific question. But understand and please know that the rules that we have proposed for the draft that's going through now as far as we think we can go and stay on the right side of the law and the intent of the law.
Okay, well, my takeaway from it is basically this draft is on height limitation or whatever our regulations are is extremely important to what limitations will be enforceable in the event of a modification of the facility.
And you're
At
absolutely
least
right.
that's my takeaway. Maybe I'm
Yeah,
totally off
and
base.
you'll be able to see those criterias on page 1-18 if you go on the website and you go and click on it. There's regulations of facilities subject to a design review permit, and it's pretty extensive on what you look for when you do a modification. And I think
haven't
that's
looked
why
at any of that
yeah,
before this meeting. So.
and I think that's why it's so hard to answer, because there's so many different parts and elements that our staff has to look in order to really approve those modifications, or whether it is substantially it's a substantial change or not. So
Thank you very much for your time.
And Mayor Pro Tem.
Etta?
Yes.
One of the things that I believe, and I believe it's what you're saying, is that it's critical that we pay attention to that new installation, because that's going to dictate what happens down the road when they want to modify it.
I mean, that's what I'm trying to emphasize.
and-
I know Mr.
and-
Kramer said it at least 2 or 3 times,
Right.
but I don't think it hurts to be said over and over
And
again.
when you actually get the draft, if you don't have it already, on page 1-16, right at the very top, 4 says height, and it says all new facilities, as well as substantial changes to existing facilities shall comply with the applicable zone height limit as it currently exists. So the highest that we would have in Ojai right now is 25 feet in certain zones, correct? In residential. And then what's the height limitation in a commercial zone? Does anybody know offhand? Is it 35?
I'm not sure off the top.
Okay, but whatever the maximum height limit is in that zone is as high as it can go with new construction. Is that correct?
Mayor Pro Tem, you're absolutely right as far as you've gone. I would just want to add one caveat, which is the very last section of the ordinance, which is what we call the safety valve. Because to comply with federal law, if there's only one solution, then the ordinance will have to bend, but to the minimum extent possible.
Okay.
But you've got it right.
So you basically can't unreasonably withhold granting of the application because you have a 25-foot limit. It's not necessarily going to be a slam dunk.
I suppose, assuming that they can prove that they need 40 feet for it to be effective, I presume, isn't that what you're saying?
So through the mayor, if the 40-foot height limit or the 40-foot tall tower is what they need to mitigate a significant gap in their coverage, and there's no other locations, plural, two smaller sites that could serve it, then yes, you would have to approve that site.
That'll basically trump the ordinance.
I have a quick follow-up just to that point,
Okay.
because I think it speaks to your point too. That other site, no other site determination, very small city geographically, are you limited to the alternative sites within the city limits when a alternative site may meet that gap outside the city limits? Can we mandate that alternative site evaluation outside the city limits?
The problem with that is that we can't zone outside the city. So for us to be able to say there's a less intrusive site, we have to have the authority to grant it. That's
my question.
And
exactly.
So so the answer is, we couldn't, unless we had zoning authority outside of the city, some extended zoning authority, we couldn't say you have to go outside the city unless we're actually capable of granting that location.
We're talking county here.
I know we are.
What if the county said, there was an agreement where, we're okay with that site? I mean, what I'm trying to get at here is the special circumstance of a very geographically small city, where the clear alternative best least intrusive site may be just across the city limits line, and the county was fine with that, theoretically. Are our hands tied?
This is an area of law that frankly has not been subject to any court decisions I'm aware of. Tripp, are you aware of any court decisions in this area?
So to the extent that you're not forcing other sites always out of the jurisdiction of the city of Ojai, it wouldn't be, on a case-by-case basis, impermissible to ask them to look at sites where you knew you could get a zoning approval. Remember, the test for whether it's a available site is if it's technically feasible, so it works from the applicant's perspective, and potentially available, meaning that they can get a zoning and a landlord approval at that site. So as long as those two, you can say with a straight face that, yes, we know and have substantial evidence to back up that those two are true, then it's a potentially available alternative site.
All right, well.
Any more comments or
No,
questions?
I have no more comment. Thank you. You've been very helpful.
Oh, no, thank you. Very good questions.
Mayor Lara,
Yes.
I would just like to announce that the dates in the report are actually, the planning commission hearing will be February 4th, not February 3rd, and the city council hearing will be February 24th, not February 27th. So comments for planning commission should be submitted next week as the packet will go out. For city council, they should be submitted by February 3rd if they want to be included in the packet. But again, up until the meeting, they can submit comments and we'll put them on the dais.
Yeah,
Yes.
and
Yeah,
even
you
at
could
the meeting
definitely.
too?
And at the meeting, and I'll post the schedule on the website.
Councilmember Haney?
I just had a question on this, on the height. It started on this proposed site, the original site. They started at 65 feet and then they negotiated, well, we'll come down to 55 feet. What if they had said we'll come down to 35 feet? How often do they have the right to raise their footage? Could they, it sounded like they were disingenuous with their approach. Yeah, we'll agree to go to 35 knowing that tomorrow they could resubmit a plan to raise it 10%, and they could do it the day after and the day after. How often can they request the permit process? Is it open-ended? Is it once a year? Is it 5 times a year?
Right, so without being specific about any particular projects, the answer is in the cumulative nature of the right to expand. So what that means is there's a cap on how many times they can expand under Section 6409 rights. And once you reach
do we know what that number is?
We do. If you open up the draft ordinance to proposed section 06.060, it lays out the findings for approval for a design review permit. It's on. They begin on page 1-20. And they are laid out specifically for the rules that apply to the type of facility in the proposed location that it's in. So, for example, under subsection D, it applies to wireless towers on private property.
Right.
It shows you what those cumulative limits are, so 10% or 20 feet in height from the structure that existed on the date that Section 6409 was enacted, which is February 22nd, 2012. They can apply for as many modifications within those cumulative limits as they want, but if the modification would expand beyond the cumulative limit in any direction under any factor, then it is not required for approval under 6409, and it would be discretionary. So to answer your question, there's a cap. They can't continue up forever, but they can apply for as many modifications within that area as they want to.
Okay.
Mayor Pro Tem Watts.
My question doesn't have to do with what they can apply for, but the timing of it. Let's say that they receive an approval to put a cell tower up at 30 feet. And before it's even begun construction, they apply for a modification to take it to 50 feet. That's something that would not fall out of the substantial for height, the substantial change, yet we don't even have the structure there yet.
The short answer is that you have to modify an existing tower or base station, and if it's not there, it's not existing. It may have a legal existence, but a physical existence is the second part. Tripp, this is an area we haven't discussed, so he may disagree with me. Let's see.
Just a little bit. So remember, it's really important to know whether it's a wireless tower or a base station because they're defined differently, and the definitions really impact the scope of authority. So under a definition for a wireless tower, it is a structure that is, its sole purpose is to support wireless and transmission equipment, or its primary purpose at least. The commission indicated that it is that structure for that purpose, whether it has equipment on it or not, and potentially whether it's constructed or not. So you could potentially modify a wireless tower even though it hasn't been built yet. A base station is different because it's something that has wireless equipment on it and a valid permit. So in your scenario, you approve it on, that's day 0. They haven't built anything for 30 days. Within the time that you approved it and built it, there's no wireless transmission equipment. It's technically not a base station yet, so it's not available for modification. But this is highlighting the really technical nature of the rules because understanding exactly what kind of structure it is dictates the scope of discretion about whether Section 6409 applies or not.
Any other questions from any of our commissioners, council members? I'm going to go back to the audience. Scott and Jeffy. Jeffy.
Good evening, Planning Commission, Mayor. And City of Ojai residents, I understand we're live. They can watch us right now. And so what I have is a short presentation. My residence is 414 Drone Avenue here in Ojai, California. It's also my business office, and it's a model of a building that's very important to the Ojai Valley for a number of reasons. About 2005, there was a windstorm, and it knocked the steeple right clear off the house and did some damage to the fence structure around the property. And being a person into the dendrology, the trees you mentioned, and I went out and saw that it knocked a number of trees over also that year. It was quite a windstorm. And so I called the insurance adjuster, and he came out and said, act of God type of stuff. And I said, yes, it's FHA covered. I said, that is my first home purchase. And he said, you're going to rebuild the steeple? And I said, yes, I have the original materials. I'd like to rebuild the steeple and put it back up in the house at the very least. And so he authorized a sizable check, over $5,000, to be rendered to the name of the persons on the deed. And it disappeared. Just vanished. And I talked to the owner of the property, and I said, did you happen to take that check? And he said, yes, I did. I said, well, it's a line item. It's an item. You're not supposed to take act of God money from that and do something with it, like a party, or go out and drink a cerveza. You're supposed to give it to me to put on the top of the roof. It's an expensive property. It's an interesting museum quality property. What have you done with the check? It's over $7,000. And at the same time that year, he decided he wasn't going to file a registry of charitable trust paperwork with the government, federal government, for I had, in 2002, founded a nonprofit organization. Now, that nonprofit organization is in arrears, approximately $5,700 and change right now. So between the two numbers, that's about $12,000. So after talking with him for quite some time, I got a little upset and irritated, as probably most reasonable and rational business people would, and I said, Barry and Martha, guess what? I'm taking you into court. And so I went down to the court, and I rendered them the information about the corporation. The identity number is right here, 2379333. Well, this actually has merits to what you're talking about here with the cell phone towers, and here's why. That particular organization, called the R-Links Foundation, is also listed at 414 Drone under Scott M. Jaffe. It's who I am. And I have my identification in the knapsack also. There's no weapons in there of any sort that one would consider a weapon until, well, we fast forward to that later, potentially. Now, after I put this together, I submitted this to the court with all the articles of incorporation and everything, and I also stopped down at above the Chase Bank in Victoria area down in Ventura, you have the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And so I wrote deliberately a very interesting piece about fraud. This individual had been holding a CEO position underneath me while I was unable to do that business, and I asked him to fax, just simply fax, one document, one very straightforward document back to the Federal Tax Board and the Federal Registry of Charitable Trusts. He refused to do it, and I don't know why. And I've asked him where it's gone, and he doesn't want to know it. Well, they refuse to give me the letter back. They won't send it to me until I pay them the $5,000, I think it's right here at this tax year is $2,916.67. It's now somewhere above $5,000. And I don't want to be Stanley Tukey Williams to this type of thing, so I said, well, just let it sit right there. There it sits. Now, here's an interesting point I want to share with you at the council level of why this technology is important to me. See, this is a little magnetic piece here. It's metal. And I say it's magnet because if you take a magnet to it, it'll stick. It's metal. Okay, now this gentleman here does not consider this probably a dangerous weapon unless it's like the character of some extraordinarily trained Army intelligence officer gone AWOL. That's not who I am. You don't have to worry about this little thing. It usually sits back here in its bag. Now, regardless of how or why,
Yeah.
regardless of how or why that information is there, today in the Harper's Monthly magazine at the library, which you can look at. You don't have to have copies made for you. You can go to the library on your own and look at it if you'd like. It's probably great exercise. And it appears that back in November of 2014, the Supreme Court brought in Mr. Martinez from the government and a lawyer for a man named Yates, Mr. John L. Yates, evidently a commercial fishing vessel owner. He had been ordered back to port. What had happened was he had gone fishing, and he had violated under Section 1519 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, O-X-L-E-Y. He had violated the destruction of, quote, any record, document, or tangible object, end quote. Now, they said the fish, under a certain limit, are tangible objects. Well, they said, what about a picture? I said, what do you mean a picture? That's not it, but if it's on a flash drive, that's a tangible object. And they have a few papers.
Sorry, excuse me, Mr. Jeffy, to interrupt you. I know I'm definitely want to listen to your concern and stuff, but I just want to make sure that we are considerate of other people, other people wanting to comment.
All of a sudden?
Yeah.
Please, Mr.
So if you could please connect your comments.
Yes, here's
to
the connection for you.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Above that line in that metal, that wooden piece of the room here, you see the top of the American flag you pledged to? It's blue. That symbolizes your 65-foot permit. You go any higher than that, you're getting into the EPA area. Okay? So instead of ordering people to go into the houses around here and take out dental servers without the firmware being rebuilt, what you'd want to do is pay attention to what happens when a compiler comes out of this document. Now, this document pack is going to do some things to us, okay? That's a compiler. 1,900,000 of these disappeared. And here's where it goes. The cell phone tower isn't really the question. The aesthetics really aren't the question. What do these compilers do if you don't stick the thing in the ground where they say is probably the best place to put it, and then later build the trees up around it and build a nice little thing to make it look all pretty for you? They might even have like a 15-foot mansion, 15-story mansion one day back here. I mean, it's very stable ground. But while you go into the dental records of people's houses, you take their x-rays out of their houses. I'm not alleging you did this or didn't, but somebody did. And I go to the dentist the other day, and she says, you have a broken file underneath your crown, filling. And I said, no, I don't. She showed me the picture. I have my x-ray. And so I'm wondering, when you take a hold of a server and you get a hold of this game and you're playing a game with being God and making decisions and you want the magnets to not bother you from that place out there in Europe underground, you stick the thing in the ground. And then you'll worry later about it. And you say, why do you want to build it 35 feet higher than what the permit was? Are you looking to get into our Sespe Wilderness area and bother our Condor Preserve? Are you trying to drag it down all the way to Miramonte, where you have an electricity grid that goes from the Wendy's International area all the way straight out to Santa Barbara? And now they want to know in Santa Barbara, why do they see things moving in their eyesight that look like a scoper's rifle that seems to fall down all at once? But it wasn't there until I took this out. How many of you are feeling heartburn?
Mr. Jeffrey, if I may
I'll put it
interrupt
away.
just one more
I'll put it
time,
away. I'll put
I
it
do
right
want to
back.
be considerate, and I know you have really
No, you
good
don't.
points and
If you wanted to
everything.
be considerate, Mr. Mayor, I don't think you'd be interrupting me
I
because you
just-
said there were no time limits tonight.
There isn't, but I also want to make sure that we get to the point.
Barely finished. Okay? You're playing a game with entertainment arts, and it's a computer system that started up after Kennedy was assassinated. Okay? There's been some compiler activity of question in the world. Edward Snowden maybe took one flash drive, a tangible object, or he took 10 flash drives. It doesn't really matter. The fact is, if you don't stick the thing in the ground and deal later with whether it looks good or not, these guys will be happy to take the money out of you. But you owe me as a city $25,000 for a report that you took into the sheriff's department. The federal government, using the same information, hit bin Laden, owes me $25 million. So the state owes me $25,000, the federal government owes me $25 million. You're in collections and you have 1.9 million compilers running around someplace.
Well,
What do
Mr.
you
Jeffrey,
do?
I appreciate your comments and thank you so much. Mr. Ulrich?
Good evening, William Ulrich, 487 Gridley Road. I'll try to keep my points succinct and short. Number one, I may be misspeaking myself, but it's my understanding that in PL zoning, well, you may have, you don't have a height limit, which my point being, you may have to rezone substantial portions of the community in order to generate congruence with this draft ordinance, number one. Number two, the sense I get, especially when everybody goes up against, we had this sort of a similar situation relative to the presentation regarding the group home on Quail Oak Drive. There's a sense of abdication, there's a sense of resignation in the community once folks start presenting so succinctly a federal regulation that was drafted with obvious intent of making it so that local jurisdictions really had very little purview. And I realize that the ordinance that you're considering needs to reflect that. However, from a practical perspective, there was an earlier reference or query regarding permitting. If our permitting fees for the city were, you can't make a profit, but you can apply a fee for anticipated costs, which in my opinion, once again, you can take exception as council, that anticipated costs of resistance, so to speak, by the city. We're a very small geographic area. If, as a matter of course, we had it as our perspective and our expressed intent, not in the ordinance, but from a practical perspective, to resist the installation of cell towers in the city limits, I dare gainsay most of these large companies got better things to do. And if it just meant them moving it across the way into the county, you wouldn't have to have the purview as far as zoning authority. There, as a practical matter, they would be going there. And I say this from the perspective of when the cellular communications companies come in and say, well, we've got spots that we've got to maintain or manage or improve, and that's why we need a cell tower here. We take their word for it. because we don't have on staff an engineer that can take that technical information, process it, and object or take exception to it. So what I'm basically saying is I think the community needs to adopt an approach that renders it a resistance to this process and not abdicate our responsibility to ourselves, to our neighbors, and to our antecedents, and to a great extent, since everyone talks about the nature of the Ojai community, our forebears. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor?
Thank you.
I have a
Yes,
comment
Mayor
with
Pro Tem.
regard to, somewhat of a comment as to what Mr. Ulrich alluded to. As far as private property, it's not that the city has to provide any property for these cell companies. They have to find somebody that's willing to allow them to construct it on their property first. If nobody that owned private property in the city of Ojai would enter into a lease agreement with a cell company, we wouldn't have to worry about all this. So keep in mind, it's one of us that is going to be the problem along with the cell company, because they're going to say, I don't have a problem with it for either financial reasons or aesthetic reasons or whatever. I have no problem with the cell company erecting a cell tower on my property. My question is, though, when it comes to a governmental agency, is there any obligation on the part of a governmental agency to provide a location for a cell company if they can't find any other alternative?
To answer your question to the second part, your obligation as a local government is not to prohibit them from providing wireless services. So the ordinance, the individual way that the city decides each permit application on an individual basis cannot be geared towards prohibiting wireless services. To the first part of leading into the question, I want to clarify that every wireless provider in the state of California holds what's called a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, a CPCN, from the California Public Utilities Commission, which gives them a statewide franchise into the rights-of-way. So when landlord issues get tough, when the rents get too high, when people tell them no, they can go into the streets. And the city cannot say no. They have what's called time, place, and manner control. And so it becomes a question of where, but not if. And so there is not and this is certainly by design, there is not a way to say no with absolute certainty to wireless in any given community in the nation.
Is it only within the right-of-way that they have that permission, or would it be upon any governmental property?
So it's a different permission for federal properties. Under Section 6409B, there's a streamlined process for the federal government to allow wireless facilities. I mean, it's almost sort of you use a standard contract and it's going to be permitted. And federal government is more or less exempt from local zoning constraints. It's a grayer area than it should be probably, but in any event, that's one way of having it. But there is no license to use private property for communications purposes under either federal or state law.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Commissioner
Lojowski. And this might be a further follow-up on Mr. Ulrich's comment. I'm not sure. But it seems that many of our community members would love to have a 60-day planning review, approval of their complete permits, and move on. And it seems like it would place a huge burden on our extremely small community development staff. I'm wondering if there's a way, and we obviously can't profit off of these, but perhaps, I mean, could we retain the services of your law firm on an hourly basis to process these permits, or could we hire a full-time person for our city whose express purpose is just to process these permits, and they would have to pay a fee? Does that make sense?
Through the mayor, this is not intended to be a full employment act for our law firm or anyone else. There are various firms that do help cities. We help cities. So there are firms out there that will help cities. In terms of the burden placed on cities, you're exactly correct. The FCC has basically said wireless is more important than essentially everything else. And if it causes other projects to be pushed back, so be it, because their interpretation is that Congress has said that broadband is essentially the highest priority. One of the reasons why the ordinance has an appointment provision in it is because we are a small city and because this is a burden on the city. So we don't want someone walk in and saying, here are 100 applications they'll see in 60 days. They have to come in under appointment. One appointment, one application.
That part hasn't actually been fleshed out yet, but
Right.
it's worth noting.
Some jurisdictions have basically taken the position that you can file one application under one appointment. And there's a logical reason for that, which is so that if someone walked in and said, I'm going to take one appointment, I'm going to file 60 applications, and then let the sucker down the street with the other wireless company come in and come behind me, you know, that's also unfair. That's also an unreasonable discrimination. So I think it's very likely that you'll see in the final rules a one application per appointment. This is for control purposes internally. But this is really a tough one because we are obligated to process not just within 60 days, but also the 90-day for co-locations and 150 days. It's good to be the federal government and tell cities what they have to do.
And I do note that there's an independent consultant review section on your draft ordinance to provide us that aid if we need it, right?
It's not for us to provide it, it's for whomever the city selects in its wisdom.
To
Again,
process application.
Help process, both on the zoning side and also on the building and safety side.
Great. Councilmember Haney?
Just some questions that come to mind. Does the AT&T or Verizon or any of these, do they have to do a study saying that they need a cell tower in your area? Do they have to provide anything that says, you know, we need additional towers or we need a tower? Because it seems like that might be another area that we might look at as to require them to provide that information and provide it in a manner that allows us to review it and also to fight it. They just can't, I mean, that's the question. Can they just come in and say we need a tower, or do they have to prove that there's a tower is necessary in the community?
So in true lawyer fashion, I'll tell you it depends. But the answer to your question is they need to demonstrate to you under this ordinance with clear and compelling evidence that they need a tower in order to put a site in a location that you disapprove of. If the city council or the planning commission doesn't have an issue with a particular site because it's been very well designed, it meets all of the criteria, the standards to the highest level possible, and it's a good site, no demonstration of need has to come to the front of the issue. However, because you want to make sure that you have a full record and make every type of make a decision on every kind of site, under the application requirements for CUPs, so new sites and substantial changes, item number 5 requires a statement of purpose that asks for a clear and complete written statement of the purpose and shall minimally include a description of the technical objective to be achieved. So do you have a significant gap? And an annotated topographical map that identifies the target surface area to be benefited, the number of users in that area, the full color propagation maps, so on and so forth. And these items are designed to help the city identify whether those factors I showed you for a significant gap weigh in favor of there being one or weigh against it. So the ordinance is designed to help provide that information, and you can require it if you want to make that an issue in each individual case.
Any more questions? Yes, Commissioner Nolan?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Laura. Well, this is a very delicate and sensitive and important issue. And, you know, I realize in a couple of weeks it's going to be coming to us at Planning Commission, so there, you know, there's not enough time for us to have an additional workshop or do any sort of further fleshing of the ordinance. So my concern is, and after listening to the public and just reading through this document and the presentation, is that it sounds as though getting this front-end information, in other words, about our local values, and further defining and articulating what those are. I mean, you talked about the camouflaging, how it could work on buildings. I feel like we need more time for that. We don't have it. And so I'm wondering, I don't know that there'll be enough time for us to do it and not having had any interaction to do that at our next Planning Commission meeting. I'm kind of going off on this a little bit, but could we, as a Planning Commission, actually request or ask City Council, or put this in with our recommendation, that we include guidelines, the map, or maybe a subcommittee or further workshops to further define those local values? And I realize there's this time constraint, you know, when this is all has to happen. But I want to make sure that the public has time to give further input and that we have time to be very thorough and thoughtful in including what we can include, so our decision-making process is very clear, transparent, and you know, we've got the knowledge that we need at that point.
You're going to be asked to give a recommendation to the City Council on the draft ordinance that is brought before you. There will be some changes, clearly some changes that reflect and really justify exactly what we've done here tonight, which is to get all of this information, start talking about it openly. So you certainly have the ability as the Planning Commission to make whatever recommendations you like to the City Council. I have one admonishment for you on behalf of the city attorney, which is this is the type of issue where you might be interested in, you know, I'm going to pick up the phone, I'm going to call another commissioner and just talk with him or her about it. Council members, the same thing. I'm speaking on behalf of your city attorney. Just remember your Brown Act requirements. We can't do those things. So this has to remain a public process that respects the Brown Act. This meeting was a Brown Act meeting, is a Brown Act meeting. So we're getting a lot of good information. Your meeting, the City Council meetings will be Brown Act meetings. So come up with everything that you've got individually. Talk about it at your formal session. Make whatever recommendations you like, and know that we're certainly hearing what you're saying tonight.
Will you actually be present at our Planning Commission meeting?
One or both of us will.
Oh, good. Thank you.
And I'd like to follow up what Jonathan said very well with reminding you guys that this is not the final end-all, be-all ordinance. The ordinance can be amended. The imperative to having it put into action on the date that it's that the rules are effective has to do with making sure that things don't fall through the cracks, so that there's not projects that are deemed approved because there's no process in place to move them through. And in addition, there are other less formal ways to articulate those values. I know some cities use policy resolutions. I'll caution you that the ordinance is the quote unquote the gold standard in terms of articulating those values and having a basis for the decision to deny a site because it, say, doesn't comply with those and therefore isn't the least intrusive means. But it is not the only way. But to push this issue forward and to make sure that there's a process in place, that's why we're moving at the pace at which we are.
And yes, Councilmember Haney.
I'd like to talk to Kathy's statement. So we write the ordinance, that's our base. As all ordinances can change. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing stopping us from putting a base down and still create committees and still create a living environment where we can modify, change, and adapt to this ordinance. Am I correct?
That's correct. The ordinance can be modified through your process.
Chair Foster?
In regard to the Brown Act, is it possible to, would it be possible for planning commissioners as a committee, as a whole, to meet for a Q&A session with you guys for more in-depth discussion prior to our planning commission meeting?
That
I mean,
would
is that
actually-
even a possibility?
Well, I'll just talk about the legal aspect. Whether it's a
Okay.
possibility would be a decision for the council and for the city manager. It would have to be a notice meeting because you would be there together to talk about a substantive issue. There's some minor exceptions to the Brown Act. They don't apply here, so it would have to be a Brown Act meeting. Whether the city would want to have that meeting in advance, it's up to the city.
Right. I realize the difficulty of the timing, and but looking at the technicality and the complexity of this, to wrap your mind. I mean, I read through this, and I think I could read through it 3 more times and not grasp the subtleties that abound here. So I'm just looking for an avenue for discussion, more discussion. But again, we're hemmed in time-wise, so I don't know what the answer is to that.
I don't see, Mayor, I don't see any reason why, if the commission wants to set a special meeting to have a workshop on this, they couldn't do it. There's plenty of time before the 4th.
And I'm not opposed to it either if you feel like it's
I want to know
necessary.
how my fellow commissioners think it's a good idea or not. I guess we could go around and.
Yes.
Agreed.
Well, I guess what comes up for me is more when an application is actually in front of us. That's what feels much more frightening than the fact that we have, these guys having drafted this thing and, I mean, always more information is better, but I feel I have a lot of confidence in your expertise, obviously. So I don't know that we need a whole other meeting to maybe ask the questions that maybe come up for us in the process, and maybe we could accomplish that at our regular meeting.
I agree with Rosalie on that issue as well. I believe that what you've done here is exceptional. I read through it extensively today, and it's a good base. And like Randy Haney said, or mentioned, we can build on this. And I think it's there's enough information here for us to move forward with. And I think it doesn't end with that. It begins with that. And we can then use other opportunities to update the ordinance as other issues come up. Although I still believe that having some kind of outline of local, what is it called? Local values is still going to be important, and maybe we can start working on that and have that kind of compiled for that meeting on the 4th. So I don't see the need for a special meeting.
Yeah, I've got to agree with Rosalie and Chester. I think, what's in here is a base document, and as Councilman Haney said, this is the start, and we can, build onto it afterwards. So I'm happy with what I have here.
I just feel like I have all the information I need to act on this. I think we just need to plunge in and get something down on paper and approve it. And then if it doesn't work, we can change it. But I don't think we're going to gain much by having another special meeting. I think we've gotten plenty of input here.
Yes.
And I do think you guys have done a great job drafting this original thing. So
I
I'm ready to go
appreciate,
ahead with it.
I definitely appreciate the comments. I do want to keep them,
Well, I was just going to say, as a whole, I think we're going to just move forward to the February 4th meeting.
And I want to invite you guys, if you guys have specific questions, you guys could always ask one of them if they're present and give input, because this is still a draft. It's still a draft to that point. We're still looking for recommendations. So there's always time for you to read and submit your recommendation there at the February 4th. I just want to make sure that I give an opportunity to the public to, if anybody else has any more comments, questions, concerns, whatever it is, to just come up, because we are going to be wrapping it up. Yes, Ms. Hayden.
Again, my name is Etta Haddon. It's been an interesting conversation to hear your comments about whether you were interested in a special meeting or not, and I'm talking to the Planning Commission. And I would just like to point out to you that this document that is a draft that you're going to be reviewing and making recommendations to the City Council shouldn't just be rubber stamped. I agree with you. I think Mr. Kramer and his staff are expert, but I think it's still your responsibility to review it carefully, understand it. You folks have to understand it, or it's not going to, because then your recommendations are going to go to the City Council. They have to understand it as well. So this is not just a minor, okay, great, you've got a 20-page ordinance, bang, it's done. I'm really kind of shocked at some of the comments that you're reluctant to have a special meeting to communicate about it. So I would just ask you to rethink that. It's your responsibility. That's what you're there to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the public? No? With that, I just give one more round to our council member or commissioners for last comments, or else I just would like to thank you guys for coming and giving a thorough presentation, and just like to invite the public also to make or write us a letter, whatever. There's still enough time to review these documents and go through them thoroughly before it comes to us as council members. So you're always open to either submit something through email, through our city clerk, or even come to our public hearings, through the Planning Commission hearing or our council meeting, and voicing your opinion. So there's some more time to do that. And thank you. And with that, I'll adjourn our meeting. Thanks.